Hey you. Yeah, you the one who just got comfortable. Maybe you're already in bed. Maybe the lights are low. Maybe you've got a cup of something warm nearby, or you're just lying there staring at the ceiling waiting for sleep that hasn't decided to show up yet. Well, I'm glad you're here, because tonight I want to take you somewhere. Not far, not to the future. We're going back, all the way back to one of the greatest, most fascinating, and honestly most complicated civilizations that has ever existed on this earth, ancient Rome. Now, before you say, oh no, not another lecture about emperors and gladiators, I promise you, tonight is not that story. Tonight is the story they almost never tell, the story of the women. And here's the thing that's going to keep you up a little longer than you planned. Rome, the empire that built the Colosseum, that laid roads stretching across 3 continents, that gave us laws still echoing in our courtrooms today. That same Rome looked at half of its own population and said officially, legally in writing, you are not a full person. And yet, some of those same women accumulated more wealth than senators. Some of them whispered in the ears of emperors. Some of them ran businesses, filed lawsuits, owned property, and pulled strings so quietly that history almost forgot to write their names down. Almost. So the question tonight isn't just what was life like for women in ancient Rome. The question is, how did women survive and sometimes absolutely thrive inside a world that was designed to contain them? That's what we're exploring tonight. And I think you're going to find some of the answers genuinely surprising. Now, if you're enjoying this already and we're only a minute in, do me a small favor. Hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like if it's the kind of story you want more of. And if you feel like it, drop a comment down below. Tell me where you are right now, what time it is, what you're drinking. I genuinely love reading those. It makes this feel less like a monologue and more like a conversation, which is exactly what it's meant to be. All right, dim the lights just a little more, let the night settle around you, and let's begin. Let's start with a number. 450. That's roughly the number of years the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire dominated the Mediterranean world from around 509, before the Common Era, all the way through to the fall of the Western Empire in 476 of the Common Era. For context, the United States has been a nation for less than 250 years. Rome was running the world for nearly twice that long, and in all that time not a single woman held official political office. Not one held a seat in the Senate, not one commanded a Roman legion, not one could vote. Now if you're thinking, okay, that's not so surprising for ancient times, fair point. But here's where it gets interesting. Because Rome didn't just casually exclude women, Rome built an entire legal architecture to do it. There was a concept in Roman law called tutela, and it meant guardianship. Under this system, a woman was never truly legally independent. As a girl, her father was her guardian. When she married her husband, or sometimes still, her father became her guardian. And if her husband died and her father was gone, the state appointed a male guardian for her. In the eyes of Roman law, a woman moved from being her father's responsibility to her husband's responsibility to the state's responsibility. She was legally speaking a permanent dependent. Now, one historian described it this way, and I think it's worth sitting with. Roman law treated adult women the way it treated children and the mentally incompetent. Not because Romans thought women were stupid, but because the Romans believed women lacked something they called gravitas, that quality of weight, seriousness, and authority that made a person fit to participate in public life. And gravitas in the Roman imagination was a male thing. It's almost a little ironic, isn't it? The civilization that invented concrete and engineering solutions so elegant they still haven't fully figured out how Romans made it, could not conceive of a woman casting a vote. But here is where history gets complicated, and this is why I love history. It never lets you stay comfortable with a simple story. Because while Roman law said one thing, Roman life real daily messy, Roman life often said something very different. Take the concept of patria potestas, the power of the father. Under this rule, a Roman father had absolute legal authority over every member of his household, his children, his slaves, his wife in some forms of marriage. He could in the early republic legally decide whether a newborn child lived or died. That sounds brutal, because it was. But here's the twist. Patria potestas applied to sons too. A Roman son, even as a grown adult, even as a decorated military general, was still legally under his father's authority until his father died. So in a strange way, Roman law was almost equally constraining for everyone. Men and women alike, as long as the pater familias, the father of the family, was alive. Which means the real division wasn't simply men versus women. It was age and status versus youth and dependence. Of course, women still had it harder. A son could eventually inherit his father's authority and become a paterfamilias himself. A daughter could not. She moved from one form of guardianship to another her whole life. But it complicates the picture, doesn't it? Rome wasn't just a simple patriarchy where men were free and women were caged. It was a hierarchy layered, nuanced, and full of loopholes that certain clever women learned to navigate with extraordinary skill. And this is the part I want you to really hold on to as we go through tonight's story together. Rome had two realities. The official reality written in laws carved in marble, debated in the Senate where women barely existed, and the lived reality recorded in private letters scratched onto wax tablets whispered in the marketplaces of Pompeii and Alexandria, and Carthage where women were everywhere, running households that were by any modern definition small corporations, raising children who would become emperors, managing farms and workshops and investments, building social networks so intricate and so powerful that their husbands' political careers literally rose or fell on the quality of those networks. We have evidence for all of this, not speculation, actual evidence. In Pompeii, the city frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 of the Common Era, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of wax tablets containing business transactions. And a significant number of those transactions were conducted by women. Loans made by women, property purchased by women, debts collected by women. One of the most remarkable is a woman named Faustilla, a moneylender whose records show she was running what we would today call a microlending business, offering small loans at interest to her neighbours. She wasn't exceptional, she was just well documented. There's also the matter of letters. We have an extraordinary collection of private Roman letters, many of them written by or addressed to women, that give us a glimpse into what Roman women were actually thinking, feeling, worrying about and planning. Cicero, the great Roman orator and statesman, wrote hundreds of letters to his wife Terentia, and what those letters reveal is fascinating. Terentia was not just managing the household while Cicero was away. She was managing his finances, his political relationships, and at times his legal strategy. Cicero once wrote to a friend only half-jokingly that Terentia was more involved in the affairs of the Republic than she was in their domestic ones. He meant it as a mild complaint. To us reading it 2,000 years later, it reads like an accidentally honest description of how Roman marriages, at least among the educated elite, actually functioned. The wife in the background, the wife who shaped everything, the wife who officially did not exist in public life. Now I want to be careful here, because it would be very easy to look at all of this and say, see, Roman women weren't so badly off after all, and that would be wrong. The women we just talked about, Faustilla, the moneylender, Terentia, the political strategist, these were women of privilege, women with education, women with wealthy husbands or fathers, women who had access to resources that allowed them to carve out space inside a system designed to exclude them. For every Terentia, there were thousands of women, slave women, poor women, rural women whose lives were far harder, far more constrained, far more invisible, women who worked in fields from sunrise to sunset, women who had no legal protection against violence, women whose children could be sold away from them if they were enslaved, women who died in childbirth with no more ceremony than a line in a household record. Their stories are harder to find, because the people who wrote history in Rome were almost universally wealthy men. They wrote about what mattered to them. But those women existed. Their fingerprints are on Rome too, in the food that was cooked in the cloth, that was woven in the children that were raised in the city that was built. And tonight we're going to try to find them. All of them. Not just the famous ones. Not just the powerful ones. All of them. Because here is the truth about Rome that I think gets lost in all the marble and the togas and the epic battles. Rome was not built by men alone. It was built by people, half of whom were women, most of whom history forgot to name, and I think they deserve to have their story told, even if it's just here, in the quiet, before you fall asleep. So we've set the stage. We understand the official world Roman women lived in, the laws, the limitations, the strange double life between legal invisibility and real-world presence. But here's what I haven't told you yet. It all started at birth, and for a Roman girl the very first moment of her life was already a test she hadn't agreed to take. Her father would walk into the room where she was born. He would look at her, and he would make a decision that would determine whether she lived or died. Coming up next, we're going back to the very beginning, to the first breath of a Roman girl, and the terrifying ritual that every Roman infant faced before they were allowed to become part of the family. Stay with me, we're just getting started. So we left off in a room, a small dimly lit room somewhere in Rome. A woman has just given birth. She's exhausted. She's probably in pain. And the person whose reaction she is most watching, the person whose face will tell her everything, is not the midwife. It's her husband. Or if this is her first child and her father is still alive, it might be him. Because in ancient Rome, a newborn did not automatically become part of the family. That had to be decided by a man. The ritual was called tollere liberos, to lift up the child. It was simple, ancient, and almost unbearably weighted. The midwife would place the newborn on the floor on the bare earth, or the bare stone at the father's feet, and the father would look down. If he bent down and lifted the child up, the child lived. The child had a family. The child had a name. If he turned away and walked out of the room, the child would be taken outside, left on a street corner, a rubbish heap, or near a city gate, left to the cold, the rain, and whatever stranger happened to walk by. Now I want to sit with that image for just a moment, because I think it's easy to read that in a textbook and let it slide past you like a statistic. But this was not a statistic. This was a Tuesday in Rome. This happened in ordinary families, in ordinary homes across hundreds of years. And it happened far more often to girls than to boys. We know this not just from Roman historians writing disapprovingly about it, though some did, but from a letter that has survived. An actual letter. Written in Egypt around one before the Common Era from a man named Hilarion to his pregnant wife Alice. He's away on business. She's about to give birth. And what he writes to her is so casually brutal that when I first read it, I had to put the book down for a minute. He writes, and I'm paraphrasing closely from the papyrus, "If you give birth, and it is a boy, let it live. If it is a girl, cast it out." That's it. No anger in the letter, no conflict, just a practical instruction written between updates about his travels and a reminder that she should take care of herself. If it's a girl, cast it out. The ordinary cruelty of that sentence is what haunts me. Not a villain writing it, just a husband, just a man going about his day making arrangements. Now here is where the data gets complicated, and where history asks us to hold more than one idea at once. Because scholars who have studied Roman Egypt, one of the best documented regions of the ancient world, thanks to an extraordinary preservation of papyri in the dry desert sand, have found something surprising. The rate of female infanticide and exposure varied enormously depending on class, location, and time period. Among the very poor, daughters were sometimes abandoned simply because another mouth to feed could mean starvation. Among the very wealthy, daughters were carefully raised, educated, and strategic assets in building political alliances through marriage. And in some communities, particularly in Roman Egypt, which blended Roman legal culture with older Egyptian traditions that were somewhat more favourable to women, families actually kept their daughters at rates close to their sons. So Rome abandoned its daughters is not the whole story. But the fact that it happened at all, that it was legal, that it was common enough to be mentioned casually in a personal letter, tells us something profound about the baseline value assigned to female life. A boy was an investment, a girl was a cost. That was the default calculation. And every woman who grew up in the Roman Empire grew up in a world where she knew somewhere in the back of her mind that her existence had required someone to make a choice on her behalf. But here is the part of the story that I find genuinely moving. Some of those abandoned children did not die. The practice of exposure, leaving a child out to be found, was not always or even usually a death sentence, because Rome also had a practice of picking up those children. Strangers, sometimes neighbours, sometimes people who were childless and longed for a child. Sometimes, and this is the uncomfortable truth, people who raised exposed children as slaves. The child who was lifted from the gutter had a life, just not necessarily the life they were born into. We even have a name for these children in Latin. They were called alumni, a word that over time morphed through centuries of educational tradition into our modern word alumni, meaning former students. But originally, alumnus simply meant a child someone chose to raise who was not their own. Think about that the next time you see a university alumni newsletter. The word that now represents academic achievement and school pride has its roots in the Roman practice of raising foundlings. History hides the strangest things inside our everyday language. Now, if a Roman girl was kept, if her father bent down and lifted her, if she had that first fragile victory of simply being allowed to exist, what was her childhood actually like? And this is where I want to push back against a picture I think many of us carry without realizing it. When people imagine a Roman childhood, especially a girl's childhood, they often picture something grey and joyless, strict, formal, a small person in a tiny toga being trained for a life of obedience. The reality, at least in the early years, was warmer than that. Roman children, boys and girls, both in their earliest years, played. We know this because archaeologists have found their toys, actual toys, buried with children who died young or left in dedicatory offerings at temples when a child transitioned into adulthood. Terracotta dolls with jointed arms and legs so their limbs could be posed. Miniature cooking sets, tiny clay pots and pans perfectly formed. Small figurines of animals, horses, dogs, birds. Wooden rattles. A set of knuckle bones, the ancient world's equivalent of jacks or dice played by children across every culture in the Mediterranean. One of the most heartbreaking archaeological discoveries I've ever read about is a small grave in Roman Italy, a girl judged to have been about 8 years old at the time of her death. Buried beside her were her dolls. Her favourite doll had a tiny ivory comb still tucked into its hair. She'd been combing her doll's hair, and then she was gone. 2,000 years disappear when you read something like that. But childhood for Roman girls had a kind of hidden clock ticking inside it. Because Roman girlhood was not meant to last very long. The law specifically, the laws inherited from the 12 tables, Rome's foundational legal code set the minimum age of marriage for girls at 12. 12, not as a rarity, not as a desperate exception, as a legal standard. In practice, most girls of the upper classes were married between 12 and 14. Girls from poorer families might be married a little later, perhaps 15 or 16, simply because their families couldn't afford to arrange marriages quickly. But the point stands. What we would today consider a child, a girl in middle school, was in Rome considered close enough to adulthood that her father could negotiate her marriage and she could be legally handed over to another household. And here is what makes this more than just a disturbing historical footnote. The Romans knew it was hard. We have evidence that Roman girls were aware of and mourned the childhood they were leaving behind. There was a tradition practiced by girls on the eve of their wedding of dedicating their childhood toys to the household gods. The dolls, the knuckle bones, the little clay pots, all of it placed at the family shrine, all of it set aside, a physical ritual of letting go. Imagine being 12 years old, collecting your toys the night before your wedding, placing them in front of a shrine, and understanding in that way that children understand things before they have words for them, that you will never play again, that tomorrow you belong to someone else. And yet, I keep coming back to this word yet, because even inside these constraints, Roman girls, particularly those from educated families, were given something that I think history underestimates. They were taught to read. This sounds modest, but in the ancient world, literacy was power. And Roman families, especially from the 2nd century before the Common Era onward, invested real resources in educating their daughters, not to the same level as their sons. Sons went to formal schools, studied rhetoric, learned to argue cases in the forum. Girls were mostly educated at home by tutors or by their mothers, but they read, they wrote, they studied Greek, which was the prestige language of the educated Mediterranean world, the way French was the prestige language of European courts in the 17th and 18th centuries, and some of them read voraciously. We know this partly because Roman men complained about it. This satirist Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century of the Common Era, wrote a savage poem about dinner party women who showed off their knowledge of grammar and literature and drove their husbands to distraction. She expands on poets and critics. He complained comparing such a woman to an endless stream of noise. He meant it as an insult. To us it reads like evidence. The educated Roman woman existed. She was visible enough to irritate satirists. She had opinions about grammar. She was, in other words, completely human. Can I ask you something? If you had been born in this world not as an emperor's daughter, not as a senator's wife, but as an ordinary Roman girl, what part of this would you have found hardest to bear? The legal invisibility, the short childhood, the fact that your entire future would be decided by men around you before you were old enough to have any real say. I think about this sometimes, because it's so easy to read history as something that happened to other people. People in togas, people in marble, people safely separated from us by centuries. But these were real girls, combing their doll's hair, learning to read by lamplight, counting down the days without fully understanding what they were counting down to. Their girlhood was brief, their legal rights were thin, and yet something remarkable was already forming inside them, an understanding of how to move in a world that was not designed for them, how to find the edges of their cages and press against them quietly, persistently for their entire lives. And that education, however limited, however incomplete, was going to matter more than anyone around them probably expected. Because the next chapter of a Roman woman's life was marriage. And inside the institution of Roman marriage there was a legal detail so specific, so quietly revolutionary, that it would give certain Roman women more financial freedom than women in many parts of the world would have for the next 1500 years. It all comes down to the question of who exactly owned what, and whether a Roman wife was truly her husband's, or whether she was in a very particular and important sense still her own. That's where we're headed next. Stay close. Picture this. A city of over 1 million people. the largest city on earth at its peak. Streets so crowded you could barely move at noon. Noise so constant that one Roman writer complained he could not think straight because of the hammering, the shouting, the carts, the vendors outside his window. This is Rome, 1st century of the Common Era. And somewhere in that city, in a private home in a shaded courtyard beside a fountain that muffles the chaos outside, a girl is bent over a wax tablet. She's tracing letters, Latin first, then Greek. Her tutor, possibly a Greek slave, because Greek-educated slaves were the most prized teachers in Roman households, watches her hand form each character. She doesn't know it yet. But what is happening in that quiet courtyard is one of the most quietly subversive acts in the ancient world. A girl learning to think. Here is the question I want to open this chapter with, because I think it genuinely surprises people. How educated were Roman women really? Not the famous ones, not the handful of names that appear in history books, but ordinary Roman women from families of moderate means living ordinary Roman lives. The answer is far more educated than most people assume, and the reason most people assume otherwise comes down to a very simple confusion. We know what Roman men's formal education looked like because it was public documented and celebrated. Boys attended schools called ludi in their early years, then studied under grammarians and rhetoricians as they grew older. Their education was designed to produce orators, lawyers, and politicians. It was civic training, essentially. The whole Roman machinery of public life was built on the assumption that its participants could read, argue, and persuade. Girls were not part of that machinery, so they were not part of that system. But here is what gets overlooked. The absence of formal public schooling is not the same as the absence of education. In households that could afford it and could afford it, covered a much wider range than just the super wealthy daughters were educated at home, sometimes by their mothers who were themselves literate, sometimes by the same Greek tutor who taught their brothers, sometimes both. And the curriculum, while less rigidly structured than their brothers, was not trivial. Reading, obviously, writing, arithmetic essential for anyone who would eventually manage a household budget, Greek, which was not considered an optional extra but almost a basic requirement for any educated person in the Roman world, the way a second language is considered fundamental in educated European households today. Music, the lyre primarily. And in some households, philosophy. Yes, philosophy. We know this because Roman men wrote about it, sometimes admiringly, sometimes with that particular brand of backhanded nervousness that men have historically deployed when women start asking hard questions about the nature of things. The philosopher Musonius Rufus, a Stoic who was writing and teaching in the 1st century of the Common Era, made an argument that was genuinely radical for his time. He wrote explicitly that women should study philosophy, not as a luxury, not as an ornament, but because the same virtues that made a man good reason, self-control, courage, justice, were equally available to women and equally necessary. Women have received from the gods, he wrote, the same reason as men. He was not the majority opinion, but he was not alone either. And then there is Cornelia. If there is one woman who captures what Roman female education could look like at its absolute peak, it is Cornelia, daughter of Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal, and mother of the Gracchi brothers Tiberius and Gaius, two of the most consequential political reformers in Roman Republican history. Cornelia was born around the year 190 before the Common Era. She was widowed, relatively young. Her husband Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus died when she was probably in her late 30s, and she raised her surviving children largely on her own. She was by every account that survives extraordinary. When a king of Egypt sources suggest it was Ptolemy VIII sent her a marriage proposal, after her widowhood she refused him. Just refused. A king of Egypt. She had her children to raise, she reportedly said. She had her work, and that work included education, both the education of her sons and her own continued intellectual life. What survived of her letters, and we have fragments, possibly authentic, possibly later compositions, the historians debate this, shows a woman of sharp intelligence, strong opinions, and complete comfort, wielding the Latin language as a precision instrument. In one letter thought to be addressed to her son Gaius before his political career reached its most dangerous phase, she urges restraint. She writes about the burden of the family name, about the cost of political ambition, about her own exhaustion. It reads less like a Roman matron being properly maternal and more like a brilliant, tired woman who has watched the world chew up the people she loves and is trying one more time to pull someone she cares about back from the edge. Roman society honoured her. After her death, a statue was erected in her memory in Rome with an inscription that read simply, Cornelia, mother of the Greci. No mention of her education, no mention of her intellect, no mention of the king she turned down, just mother. Rome was like that. It could contain a woman's full humanity and still choose to remember only the part that served the official story. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. Everything we've talked about so far, the tutors, the philosophy, the letters in Greek Cornelia, and her extraordinary life, this was the world of the educated elite. The top maybe 10 or 15% of Roman society at generous estimate. What about everyone else? What about the daughter of a blacksmith in Ostia, the girl growing up in a small farming village in North Africa, the daughter of a freedwoman running a small bakery on a side street in Pompeii? Here the evidence is thinner, but it exists, and it tells a more nuanced story than poor women were illiterate. Graffiti. One of the most egalitarian historical sources we have is graffiti, because graffiti by definition is written by ordinary people, not senators composing speeches, not historians shaping narratives, just people who had something to say and a wall to say it on. Pompeii is covered in it. Over 11,000 pieces of graffiti have been identified on the walls of Pompeii alone, and a portion of them, a meaningful portion, appear to have been written by women. How do we know? Sometimes the writer identifies themselves by name and the name is feminine. Sometimes the content makes the context clear, a note to a lover, a price list for goods. A woman sold a declaration of feeling that only makes sense coming from a particular voice. One of the most famous pieces of Pompeian graffiti found near a doorway reads simply, Successus the weaver loves Iris the innkeeper's slave girl. She doesn't care for him at all, but he begs her to have pity on him. Written by his rival. Written by his rival. Think about that for a second. This person not only had enough literacy to write on a wall, but enough wit to sign it with a flourish. We don't know if the rival was a woman. We don't know if Iris could read. But we know that in that neighbourhood, in that world, literacy was not confined to senators' libraries. It was on the walls. It was everywhere. There is another piece of evidence I find quietly extraordinary, and it comes not from Italy but from the far northern edge of the empire. Vindolanda, a Roman fort on what is now the English-Scottish border, built as part of the frontier defence that would eventually become Hadrian's Wall. In the waterlogged soil beneath the fort's remains, archaeologists in the 1970s began finding something almost miraculous. Writing tablets, thin slivers of wood no bigger than a modern postcard, covered in ink that had impossibly survived for nearly 2,000 years in the wet northern ground. Most of the tablets were military records, supply lists, duty rosters, requests for leave, but among them one stands apart. It is a letter from a woman named Claudia Severa to her friend Sulpicia Lepidina. Both women were wives of senior officers stationed at nearby forts. The letter is an invitation. Claudia is inviting Sulpicia to her birthday party. She writes, and I find this genuinely touching every single time I read about it. She writes that she hopes Sulpicia will come, that she will be unhappy if she doesn't, that she misses her. And then at the bottom of the letter below the formal text that was probably dictated to or written by a scribe, there is a short addition in a different hand. Claudia herself wrote those last few lines. Scholars believe this because the handwriting shifts the trained professional hand of a scribe, and then beneath it a slightly less polished script but fully readable. Her own words, added personally, because some things apparently you have to write yourself. 2 women, friends, living at the ragged edge of the known world in the cold and mud of northern Britain 2,000 miles from Rome, one of them missing the other and putting it in writing. It is the oldest surviving example of a woman's handwriting in Britain, and what she chose to write with her own hand after all the formal courtesies was simply, "I want to see you." Does that surprise you? I think sometimes we expect ancient people to feel ancient, to be somehow less vivid, less warm, less recognizably human than us, and then you find a birthday invitation in a muddy field in northern England, and a woman's handwriting at the bottom, and she's missing her friend, and 2,000 years collapse like paper. The picture we're building of Roman girls and women is getting more complicated, isn't it? Not the flat oppression a quick reading of Roman law would suggest, but not freedom either. Something stranger and more human than either of those simple stories. Girls who were educated, sometimes brilliantly. Women who read philosophy and wrote letters and ran numbers and had opinions about grammar that annoyed satirists. And alongside them, other women washing dishes, kneading bread, selling fish in the market, who could read just enough to write on a wall, or maybe not at all, but who had inner lives just as rich and just as real. All of them navigating the same fundamental tension, a world that told them they mattered less, and a daily life in which they were indispensable. And that tension between what Rome said about women and what Rome actually needed from them comes into sharpest focus the moment a girl stops being a daughter and becomes a wife. Because Roman marriage was one of the most legally sophisticated institutions in the ancient world. And buried inside it was a distinction between 2 types of marriage, 2 types of legal relationship that gave certain Roman women a degree of financial independence so significant that historians are still arguing about just how transformative it really was. The details matter here, and they are, I promise you, far more interesting than they sound. So stay with me. We're about to walk into the world of the Roman wedding. Let's talk about weddings. Specifically, let's talk about a Roman wedding night detail that almost nobody mentions in history class. And I promise you, by the time we get to the end of this chapter, you will look at the institution of marriage itself slightly differently than you did before. But first, the dress. A Roman bride on her wedding day wore a white tunic, the tunica recta, woven in one piece, belted at the waist with a band of wool tied in a special knot called the nodus Herculaneus, the knot of Hercules. This knot was not just decorative, it was symbolic, and it was the groom's job to untie it on the wedding night. This symbolism was considered protective. Hercules was associated with fertility and safe childbirth, and also, let's be honest, slightly theatrical. Over this tunic she wore a flame-coloured veil, not white, flame, a deep, vivid saffron orange that Romans called flammeum, and this colour was so central to the Roman wedding that the verb for getting married for a woman was sometimes written as nubere, meaning to veil oneself. Her hair was arranged in an ancient-style 6 separate braids pinned up that was so old by the classical period that it was only ever worn by brides and vestal virgins. She wore shoes dyed to match the veil, she carried flowers, and she was in the vast majority of cases somewhere between 12 and 17 years old. Now, weddings in Rome were not quiet private affairs, they were community events. The ceremony itself was relatively brief, a joining of hands called the dextrarum junctio, witnessed by at least 10 citizens, a sacrifice to the gods, the signing of the marriage contract, and a shared meal. But what came after was the part that mattered socially: the wedding procession. As evening fell, the bride was escorted from her father's house to her new husband's house, on foot, through the streets, accompanied by torchbearers, musicians, and a crowd of guests who sang traditional songs. And here is the detail I love because it says everything about Roman social culture in one image. The songs they sang were called verses fessenin verses, and they were deliberately, almost aggressively bawdy, ribald jokes, teasing commentary on the couple, the kind of humour that would make a modern wedding MC blush and probably get banned from the reception. This was not considered inappropriate. It was considered essential. The noise, the laughter, the vulgarity, it was protective, the Romans believed. It warded off evil spirits who might envy the couple's happiness. So the Roman wedding procession was essentially a loud torchlit roast of the bride and groom moving through the streets of a city of 1 million people at night, which honestly sounds kind of amazing. But underneath all the colour and the noise and the flame-coloured veils, something very serious was happening. A legal transaction of enormous consequence. And this is the part of Roman marriage that I think genuinely deserves more attention than it gets. Because Rome had not one but two distinct forms of legal marriage, and the difference between them was not ceremonial. It was financial. It was about power, and it changed everything. The older form was called marriage cum manu, literally marriage with hand. In this arrangement, when a woman married, she passed entirely out of her birth family's legal control and into her husband's. She became, in the eyes of the law, essentially equivalent to his daughter. Everything she owned, any property, any inheritance, any dowry belonged to him. If he died, she inherited as one of his children would. If she died first, her property was his. There was no her money in a cum manu marriage. There was only household money, and the household was his. The newer form, which became increasingly dominant from the 2nd century before the Common Era onward, was called marriage sine manu, without hand. And this is where it gets genuinely interesting. In a sine manu marriage, the woman did not pass into her husband's legal control at all. She remained legally connected to her birth family under her father's guardianship if he was alive, or increasingly under her own guardianship if he was not, which meant something radical. Her property remained hers. Whatever she brought into the marriage, her dowry, any inheritance, any gifts, technically remained under her control, or her birth family's control, not her husband's. He could not simply sell her land. He could not drain her accounts. He could not treat her assets as his own without her cooperation. By the late Republic and into the Imperial period, sine manu marriage had become the dominant form among the Roman upper and middle classes. Think about what that means. In a world where women could not vote, could not hold office, could not plead their own cases in court, in most circumstances a significant portion of Roman wives retained legal ownership of their own property. A Roman wife with her own wealth was not simply dependent on her husband's goodwill. She had leverage, not unlimited leverage, not equality, but leverage. And then there was the dowry, the dues. When a Roman woman married, her family typically provided a dowry, a sum of money or property given to the husband at the time of the marriage to support the household. This sounds straightforward. But Roman law made it complicated in a way that actually protected women. Because in Roman law, the dowry was never truly the husband's to keep permanently. If the marriage ended through divorce or through the husband's death, the dowry had to be returned to the wife or to her family on her behalf. The husband was considered legally a kind of custodian of the dowry during the marriage. He could use it, he could invest it, but he could not simply absorb it. This created a fascinating dynamic. A Roman man who treated his wife badly, who drove her to divorce, faced a real financial consequence. He had to give the money back, and the sums involved were not trivial. Dowries among the Roman elite could be enormous. We have records of dowries worth hundreds of thousands of sestertii, enough to buy multiple properties, fund a small business, or keep a family comfortable for years. A woman walking out of a bad marriage was not walking out empty-handed. She was walking out with her dowry. In the context of the ancient world that is, I want to say this carefully but clearly genuinely progressive. Now here is the thing about Roman divorce that catches most people completely off guard. It was easy. Absurdly easy by any historical standard. In Rome, a marriage could be ended by either party, either the husband or the wife, simply by declaring the intent to end it. No court, no formal legal proceeding, no lengthy process. You said it was over and it was over. The Latin formula was stark in its simplicity. A husband could say, "Tuas res tibi habeto," take your things and go. A wife or her family on her behalf could use the equivalent. And then it was done. By the standards of most of human history, by the standards of medieval Europe, where divorce was essentially impossible for centuries, or of early modern England, where even Henry VIII had to tear the church apart to get out of one marriage, Roman divorce was startlingly casual. We have records of Romans who were married and divorced multiple times, not scandals, just facts recorded in passing. Cicero, that inescapable figure of the late Republic, divorced his wife Terentia after 30 years of marriage, a marriage that by his own earlier letters he had described with genuine warmth. The reasons he gave were vague, probably financial, possibly political. He then married a much younger woman named Pudicitia, who was reportedly his ward, which, and this is me editorializing, not a historical judgment, was the kind of move that tells you a lot about a person. He divorced her too within the year, because she appeared, according to his friend Atticus, insufficiently grief-stricken at the death of Cicero's daughter Tullia. I told you he was inescapable. But what about women initiating divorce? This is where the evidence gets genuinely complicated. In theory, under sine manu marriage, a woman, or more precisely her family on her behalf, could initiate a divorce. And in the later Republic and the Imperial period, there are enough examples of women doing exactly this that it cannot be dismissed as a legal technicality that never happened in practice. We have the case of Sempronia, wife of a prominent senator, who was described by the historian Sallust as a woman of formidable education, wit, and reckless personal life, someone who had, in his disapproving words, frequently violated her marriage vows. We have Mesia of Sentinum, who reportedly pleaded her own legal case in the Forum, something women were technically barred from doing so effectively that she was nicknamed the Androgyne by the crowd. Not a kind nickname, but a memorable one, and she won. We have the example of a woman mentioned in a legal commentary by the jurist Ulpian, writing in the early 3rd century of the Common Era, in which he notes completely matter-of-factly that a wife who is being mistreated has legal recourse to end the marriage and reclaim her dowry. The law, in other words, acknowledged that a wife might need protecting from her husband. That acknowledgement, codified in Roman law, is more than many legal systems in history have managed. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I genuinely think it's worth sitting with. What does it do to a woman, to any person, to know that they can leave, even if leaving is hard, even if society judges them for it, even if the practical obstacles are significant? There is something psychologically different about a person who knows the door is unlocked versus a person who's been told the door doesn't exist. Roman women, at least those with property and family connections, knew the door was unlocked. Not all of them walked through it. Many stayed in difficult marriages for practical reasons, children, finances, social pressure. The same reasons people stay in difficult situations today. But they knew, and I think that knowledge shaped how they moved through their marriages, how they negotiated, how they pushed back, how they built their own networks of influence and security inside households they technically did not control. There is one more detail about Roman weddings I want to leave you with because it has stayed with me since the first time I encountered it. On the morning after the wedding, the first morning the new bride woke up in her husband's house, she performed a small ritual. She made an offering to the household gods, the lares, the small ancient protective spirits that every Roman home kept in a little shrine, usually near the hearth. She brought them a small gift, a bit of incense, a few coins, sometimes flowers, and in doing so she was formally welcomed into the household spiritual community. She was no longer a guest, she was home, or at least she was in the place she was now supposed to call home. Whether it ever truly felt like home depended entirely on the man she'd been given to the family she'd entered, and the luck of her particular life. And that luck, that daily intimate reality of life inside a Roman household, is exactly where we're going next. Because the Roman home was not just a place where women lived. It was in many ways the place where they ruled. Not openly, not officially, but in the thousand small decisions that keep a household and an empire actually functioning. And some of those women ran operations that would impress a modern chief executive. That story is just ahead. There is a building in Pompeii that most tourists walk past without stopping. Not the Forum, not the amphitheatre, not the famous brothel that always has a line. It is a private home modest by Pompeian standards, no grand atrium, no elaborate mosaic entrance known to archaeologists as the house of Lucius Caecilius Jucundus. And inside that house, when excavators dug through the volcanic debris in the 1850s, they found something that rewrote what historians thought they knew about Roman economic life. 153 wax tablets, business records, financial transactions, receipts, contracts, records of payment dating from roughly 52 to 62 of the Common Era, the last decade before Vesuvius ended everything. Lucius Caecilius Jucundus was a banker, a money changer and financial agent, someone who facilitated auctions, collected payments on behalf of clients, and managed the kind of financial transactions that kept a Roman city running. And running through those 153 tablets woven into the fabric of his business like threads you only notice when you hold the cloth up to the lighter women. Women conducting transactions, women listed as parties to contracts, women receiving payments, women witnessing deals, not as exceptions, as participants, ordinary documented business-like participants in the financial life of a Roman city. One of those tablets records a woman named Umbricia Januaria, receiving a sum of money from an auction sale. Another records a freed woman conducting a property transaction independently. Another lists a woman as a witness to a significant financial agreement, a role that required legal standing literacy and the trust of the parties involved. These women did not make the history books. They were not empresses or priestesses or poets. They were the financial infrastructure of a mid-sized Roman port city, and they were everywhere. But to really understand what Roman women did, what they actually managed day after day, inside and alongside their households, we need to talk about the domus itself, the Roman home, because the Roman home was not simply a place where a family slept and ate. It was an economic unit, a production centre, a social hub, a political venue, a place of worship, a place of business. And the woman who ran it, the domina, the mistress of the house, was managing all of those functions simultaneously. Think about what that actually involved. A moderately wealthy Roman household might contain anywhere from a handful to several dozen slaves each with specific roles: cooks, cleaners, doorkeepers, nurses, tutors, secretaries, wool workers, messengers. Managing that many people, assigning tasks, monitoring quality, resolving disputes, replacing workers who were sick or died, training new ones, was by any modern definition a human resources operation. On top of that, the domina oversaw the household food supply. In a city like Rome, that meant understanding markets, knowing prices, detecting when a merchant was cheating you on the weight of grain, or the quality of oil, and managing a budget that had to stretch across unpredictable costs. She managed the household's textile production because Roman households, even wealthy ones, produced significant amounts of their own cloth. Wool was carded, spun, and woven inside the home. The domina supervised this, and in many households participated in it herself. Not because she had to, but because woolworking was considered one of the highest expressions of Roman female virtue. The ideal Roman matron in the official imagination was always shown with a spindle. She received visitors on her husband's behalf when he was absent. She managed correspondence. She made decisions about the education of her children. She handled the day-to-day financial transactions of the household, purchasing supplies, paying workers, managing the small loans and credits that kept domestic life running. And in her husband's absence, which could be extended in a world where men went to war, went on political missions, went on business trips that could last months, she did all of this alone, not as a deputy, as the person in charge. We have a remarkable window into what this looked like in practice through the letters of Pliny the Younger, a Roman lawyer, writer, and administrator who lived from roughly 61 to 113 of the Common Era. Pliny wrote hundreds of letters that survived, and they are one of the great treasures of Roman literature, not because they record great battles or political upheavals, but because they record ordinary life with extraordinary vividness. Among them are letters to and about his wife Calpurnia. Pliny married Calpurnia when she was quite young, probably in her early teens, as was Roman custom, and he was considerably older. The age gap is uncomfortable to modern eyes, but what Pliny's letters reveal about Calpurnia herself is something worth attending to. He writes about her with what reads genuinely like affection and respect. He describes her reading his speeches and his poetry not just politely but critically. She apparently set his letters to music which he found touching. When he was ill, she stayed awake with him through the night. When he was in court, she sent messengers to find out how the case was going. In one letter written while he was away and she had gone to the country for her health, he writes that he misses her so much he picks up her portrait and holds it, and then immediately feels foolish about it, which is the kind of small, embarrassing human detail that makes a person who died 2,000 years ago suddenly feel very close. But it is another detail in Pliny's letters that I find most revealing about what a Roman wife actually did. When Pliny received his appointment as governor of Bithynia and Pontus, a province on the southern coast of the Black Sea, it was a major administrative posting. He was going to manage an entire Roman province. And one of the things he arranged before he left was that Calpurnia would manage significant aspects of the family's affairs in his absence. Not because she had no choice, because she was capable. He trusted her judgment on financial matters. He trusted her social navigation. He trusted her to maintain the household's relationships with clients, with political allies, with the web of reciprocal obligations that Roman social life ran on. He trusted her, in other words, to be him while he was gone. Now I want to complicate this picture slightly because I think honesty requires it. Pliny was wealthy, educated, and by Roman standards unusually thoughtful about the women in his life. Not all Roman husbands were Pliny. We have other voices in the record. The agricultural writer Columella, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, gives detailed instructions for the ideal management of a Roman estate, and his description of the vilica, the wife or female partner of the estate manager, is revealing in a different way. She should, he says, rise before her husband. She should make sure the slaves have started their tasks before she allows herself to sit down. She should be modest, sober, hard-working. She should not leave the estate unnecessarily. She should not receive visitors her husband has not approved. She should keep the household accounts accurately. It reads partly like a job description and partly like a set of constraints, and I think both readings are true simultaneously. The Vilica had real power over the household, over the slaves, over the day-to-day running of a working farm, but that power existed inside a box whose dimensions were set by her husband. She could decide how the grain was stored. She could not decide to visit her mother without permission. That tension, real authority inside rigid limits is, I think, the defining condition of most Roman women's domestic lives. Not powerlessness, not freedom. Something more complicated and more human than either. Here is something I find genuinely fascinating, and it comes from a very unexpected source. The Roman cookbook. The only Roman cookbook that survives in any complete form is a collection of recipes attributed to a man named Apicius, most likely compiled in the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, though drawing on older material. It is an extraordinary document, not because of what it tells us about food, though the recipes are genuinely interesting, ranging from elegant to absolutely bizarre, but because of what it tells us about who was doing the cooking. Or rather, who was not doing the cooking. The recipes in Apicius are not domestic recipes. They are professional recipes, the kind of dishes served at wealthy dinner parties, the cena, the Roman dinner that was the central social event of elite Roman life. They require specialized ingredients, complicated techniques, multiple stages of preparation. These were not meals a domina cooked herself. These were meals she directed other people to cook slaves with specific culinary training, some of whom were enormously valuable precisely because of their skills. The domina of a wealthy household did not stand over a fire. She stood over the person standing over the fire. And knowing the difference between a good result and a bad one, knowing when the garum, the fermented fish sauce that flavoured almost everything in Roman cooking, was the right quality, knowing when the spices were fresh, knowing when a dish had been prepared correctly required real knowledge. The knowledge of someone who had learned to run a kitchen the way a modern restaurant manager learns to run a kitchen, not by cooking every dish themselves, but by knowing enough to know when something was wrong. Let me ask you this, and I'm genuinely curious what you think. We tend to use the phrase just a housewife as though it means something small, but when we actually look at what running a Roman household required, the financial management, the personnel oversight, the supply chain logistics, the social diplomacy, the educational decisions, the correspondence, the production management does, that sounds small to you. It doesn't to me. It sounds like running a small company, without a salary, without a title, without credit. And in Rome, without even the acknowledgement that what you were doing was skilled work, because the Romans had decided that skilled work, by definition, happened in public, in the forum, in the Senate, on the battlefield, and everything that happened inside the home was simply what women did. Invisible, essential, unacknowledged. The oldest story in the world. There is one woman I want to tell you about before we move on. Her name was Eumachia. She lived in Pompeii in the 1st century of the Common Era, and we know about her not from any literary source, not from anyone writing about her life, but from stone. Eumachia was a wealthy Pompeian woman, a priestess of Venus, a public benefactor, and she funded the construction of one of the largest buildings in Pompeii's Forum. A building that housed the Wool Merchants and Cloth Dyers Guild. The building still stands partially. It bears her name in a dedicatory inscription on the entrance, a dedication she made in her own name and in the name of her son. Not her husband's name, her name. She had the building constructed, she funded it, she dedicated it. And the cloth workers of Pompeii, the guild that used it, the workers who benefited from it, honoured her in return, with a statue also inscribed with her name. The statue itself was lost, but the base with the inscription survives. And the inscription says that the guild erected it in her honour, because of her excellens modestia, her outstanding modesty. I have thought about that phrase many times. Eumachia funded a major public building. She ran what was clearly a substantial wool and textile business, because you do not casually fund major public buildings unless you have serious money, and serious money in Pompeii often came from the textile trade. She held religious office. She was by any reasonable measure one of the most powerful people in her city, and what the guild chose to honour her for was her modesty, not her business acumen, not her generosity, not her civic leadership, her modesty. Because in Rome, a woman could do almost anything as long as she was careful to appear as though she was doing nothing at all. That paradox power-worn quietly achievement wrapped in the language of virtue runs through the entire history of Roman women like a thread you can pull on forever. And nowhere does it become more visible, more fraught, and honestly more explosive than in the one domain of Roman life that touched every woman and was controlled by everyone around her, her body. Because Rome had opinions about female bodies, detailed, codified, socially enforced opinions, and the gap between what Rome said about female sexuality, female desire, and female physical life, and what Roman women actually experienced, felt, and did, is one of the most startling, most revealing, and most human distances in all of ancient history. That is where we are headed next, and I'll warn you now, it is not a comfortable story, but it is a true one, and it matters. Rome had a word that had no perfect translation in any modern language. Pudicitia. You could call it chastity. You could call it sexual virtue. You could call it modesty. But none of those words quite captures it, because Pudicitia was not simply a behaviour. It was an identity, a moral status, a woman's entire social worth compressed into a single Latin concept. A Roman woman who possessed Pudicitia was respectable. Her word carried weight. Her children were legitimate. Her household was honourable. Her husband could walk into any room in Rome and hold his head up. A Roman woman who lost Pudicitia regardless of the circumstances, regardless of whether she had any choice in the matter, was something else entirely. She was infamous, stripped of social standing, effectively erased from the community of respectable Roman life. And here is the detail that I think is worth sitting with before we go any further. Pudicitia could only be lost by women. Men did not have it. Men could not lose it. The entire concept, with all its weight and all its consequences, existed exclusively to govern female behaviour. Rome built one of the most sophisticated legal systems in human history. It engineered aqueducts that carried water across mountain ranges. It produced philosophers who wrote about the equality of all human souls. And it looked at the question of desire, something that exists in every human being without exception, and decided that desire was only a problem when it lived inside a woman's body. That is not a neutral observation. That is the foundation of everything we're going to talk about in this chapter. The Roman double standard was not subtle. It was not hidden. It was written directly into the law, into social custom, and into the very language Romans used to describe human behaviour. A Roman man could have relationships with slaves, with prostitutes, with other freeborn men of lower status, with willing partners of various kinds, and none of this touched his reputation in the way it would touch a woman's. The jurist Ulpian, writing in the early 3rd century of the Common Era, spelled it out with the kind of calm legal clarity that makes it even more jarring to read a husband who had relationships outside his marriage was not committing adultery under Roman law. Adultery in Roman legal definition required a married woman. If she had a relationship outside her marriage with anyone under any circumstances, that was adulterium. A crime. If her husband did the same with someone who was not a respectable married woman, it was legally nothing at all. This was not a grey area. This was the law, written down, enforced, and then Augustus made it worse. In 18 before the Common Era, the Emperor Augustus, a man so concerned with the moral decline of Rome that he made it his personal project to fix it, pushed through a piece of legislation called the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coascendis, the Julian law on the punishment of adultery. Before this law, adultery had been a private family matter. If a husband discovered his wife had been unfaithful, it was handled within the family through divorce, through financial arrangements, sometimes through violence that the law looked away from. Augustus changed that. Under his law, adultery became a public crime, a criminal offence prosecuted in a public court. A husband who discovered his wife's infidelity was now legally required to divorce her. If he did not, if he stayed with her, knowing he could himself be prosecuted for the crime of lenocinium, pimping. Yes, a Roman husband who forgave his unfaithful wife could be legally charged with acting as her pimp. I am not editorializing. That is what the law said. And once divorced, the wife could be prosecuted in court for adultery. If convicted, she lost half her dowry, a third of her property, and was banished to an island. She was also forbidden from ever marrying again, not to a freeborn Roman citizen at any rate. Her lover, if convicted, faced similar penalties. The law applied to women. Men, as already established, remained outside its reach as long as their partners were not respectable married women. Augustus presented all of this as a moral restoration, a return to Roman virtue, a remedy for the decadence of the late Republic. What it actually was stripped of the rhetoric was the state reaching into the most intimate corners of Roman women's lives and planting a flag. Your body, the law said, is a matter of public concern. Your choices are not your own, and the consequences of stepping outside the boundaries we have drawn for you will be severe, public and permanent. Now here is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because some Roman women stepped outside those boundaries anyway. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough that their stories survive sometimes as warnings, sometimes as scandals, sometimes as something that reads across 2,000 years less like a cautionary tale and more like a portrait of a person who simply refused to be contained. The most vivid of those portraits belongs to a woman named Clodia Metelli. Clodia was born around 94 before the Common Era, into one of the most powerful aristocratic families in Rome, the Claudii, an ancient patrician clan with political connections stretching back generations. She was the sister of the notorious tribune Publius Clodius Pulcher and the wife of Quintus Caecilius Metellus Xela, a consul and one of the most prominent men of his generation. She was by all accounts beautiful, educated, enormously wealthy, and completely unwilling to behave the way Rome expected a woman of her status to behave. She moved through Roman society with a freedom that other women of her class simply did not exercise. She had a house on the Palatine Hill, the most prestigious address in Rome. She had a villa on the Tiber River where she hosted parties. She was seen publicly in places and at events where respectable Roman matrons generally did not appear. She had lovers, plural, documented, not hidden. One of them was the poet Catullus, who wrote about her with such obsessive, conflicted intensity, sometimes adoring, sometimes furious, sometimes both, in the same poem that Clodia became one of the most discussed women in all of Roman literary history, known in his poems by the thin disguise of the name Lesbia. Catullus compared his love for her to a father's love for his sons. He also wrote in one of his more bitter moments a poem about her that is so vicious it cannot be quoted in polite company, and certainly not in a YouTube video. The man had feelings, but it is not Catullus who truly defines Clodia's place in history. It is Cicero. In 56, before the Common Era, a young man named Marcus Caelius Rufus, who had at some point been Clodia's lover, was put on trial on a series of charges that included, among other things, allegedly attempting to have her murdered. Clodia was the main witness against him. Cicero was his defense attorney, And what Cicero did in that courtroom, the speech he delivered which survives and is still read in classics courses today known as the Procalio, is one of the most breathtaking examples of character assassination in the history of legal rhetoric. Rather than defend his client on the merits of the charges, Cicero decided to put Clodia herself on trial. He called her a meretrix, a prostitute. He compared her to the legendary Medea. He described her behaviour in such lurid, detailed, gleefully vicious terms that modern scholars have spent decades debating whether his account can be trusted at all, or whether it was simply a masterwork of distortion, designed to destroy her credibility so thoroughly that nothing she said could be believed. He invented a fictional conversation with her ancestor, the famously stern Appius Claudius Caecus, who supposedly rose from the dead to ask her what on earth she thought she was doing. It was rhetorical theatre of the highest order. And it worked. Caelius was acquitted. Clodia disappears from the historical record after that trial. We do not know what happened to her. We do not know how she spent the rest of her life. We do not know whether she was angry or devastated or simply moved on. We only know that the most powerful orator in Rome stood up in a public court and reduced her systematically to a punchline, and that the court laughed. What do we do with a story like that? I've thought about this a lot. Because Clodia is not a straightforward victim. She was not powerless. She came from extraordinary privilege. She wielded her social position, her beauty, and her connections with clear intention and considerable skill. She was in the terms available to her playing the game, but the game was rigged in a way that only became fully visible when she lost. A Roman man who had multiple lovers, who appeared at parties, who lived publicly and expansively and on his own terms, that was a man living a full life. A Roman woman who did exactly the same things that was a woman asking to be destroyed. Not because what she did was different, because she was. And the women who were destroyed were not only the Clodius of Rome. The women who bore the full weight of Rome's sexual double standard were not primarily aristocrats with powerful families and Tiber villas. They were women with no protection at all. A slave woman had no legal right to refuse anyone her master's guests, anyone her master chose to send to her. Any relationship she had was not in Roman law a relationship at all. It was simply something that happened to her. A prostitute, and Rome had a large, visible, legally regulated prostitution industry, was required by law to register with the authorities and give up her legal status as a respectable woman. Once registered, she was permanently infamous regardless of what circumstances had led her there. Many women who became prostitutes did not choose it. They were slaves sold into brothels. They were abandoned children, those exposed infants we talked about earlier, raised specifically for that purpose. They were war captives. They were women with no family, no resources, and no other options. Rome looked at those women and said, "You chose this. You are what you are." The law offered them nothing. There is a moment in the historical record that I find almost unbearable in what it reveals. The Roman legal jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, notes in his commentary on Roman law that a slave woman could not technically be the victim of certain crimes against her person, because she was property, and crimes against property were categorized differently from crimes against persons. He wrote this not with outrage, not with discomfort, as a legal clarification, a technical distinction. The casual bureaucratic quality of it is what gets me. Not a monster writing that, just a lawyer doing his job clarifying the rules. The most ordinary cruelty is always the most revealing. I want to ask you something before we move on. When you think about concepts like reputation, virtue, respectability, the social currency that determined whether a person was taken seriously, whether they were believed, whether they were protected, do those concepts feel entirely foreign to you, or do some of them feel in some translated form uncomfortably familiar, I am not making a direct comparison. The Roman world and our world are separated by 2,000 years of change that genuinely matters. But I think the reason stories like Clodia's land so hard, the reason we feel something reading about her even now, is that the architecture of the problem she was living inside is not entirely unrecognizable. The idea that a woman's choices about her own body carry a different weight than a man's choices about his. The idea that reputation once damaged in a particular way cannot be repaired. The idea that a brilliant, accomplished person can be reduced in a single public performance to a single accusation. These are not only ancient ideas, they are old ideas wearing new clothes. And recognizing them in Rome is, I think, one of the reasons studying history is not just interesting, it is necessary. We have spent this chapter in the realm of law of social expectation, of the rules Rome wrote, and the consequences it imposed for breaking them. But there's another dimension of Roman women's physical lives that we have not yet touched, one that was not about desire or reputation or social punishment, one that was simply about survival. Because for Roman women, the single most dangerous thing they would ever do in their lives was not defy social convention. It was give birth. The room where Roman women were most afraid was not the courtroom. It was not the forum. It was the room where new life was supposed to begin. And what happened in that room, what Roman medicine knew, what it did not know, what it tried, and what it got terribly wrong is one of the most sobering chapters in the entire history of women in the ancient world. That is where we go next. Every generation has its version of the thing that quietly took the most lives. In the medieval world it was plague. In the early industrial era it was the factory floor and the mine shaft. In ancient Rome for women it was a room in their own home. A small room usually near the back of the house, away from the street noise. A room with a birthing chair, a curved, open-seated chair specifically designed to support a labouring woman in an upright position. A room attended by a midwife, perhaps an older female slave with experience, perhaps a professional obstetrix hired for the occasion. A room where no male physician was typically present, because Roman medical convention held that childbirth was women's territory, and the presence of a man was considered inappropriate unless the situation became desperate, and desperate situations came often. Modern historians who have studied Roman skeletal remains burial records and literary evidence estimate that somewhere between 1 in every 25 and 1 in every 50 births ended in the mother's death. That sounds like a small number until you do the math. A Roman woman who survived to adulthood might face pregnancy 4, 5, 6 times or more over her reproductive years. Rome needed population, and large families were culturally encouraged, practically incentivized under Augustus's laws, and simply the reality of a world without reliable contraception. Each pregnancy was a roll of the dice, and across a lifetime of rolls the odds accumulated into something sobering. Demographic historians estimate that a Roman woman faced a cumulative lifetime risk of dying in childbirth, somewhere between 1 in 8 and 1 in 6. 1 in 6. Imagine sitting with that number, not as a statistic, as something you carried with you every day of your married life. The Romans knew childbirth was dangerous. They were not ignorant of what was happening in those rooms. What they lacked was not awareness. It was the tools to do anything meaningful about it. There was no understanding of infection. Germ theory would not exist for another 1700 years. There were no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, no surgical options that did not carry their own enormous risks. A labour that went wrong, a baby positioned incorrectly, a hemorrhage that could not be stopped, a fever that set in after delivery had very few interventions available to it. What Roman medicine could offer was knowledge of positioning herbal treatments, manual techniques passed down through generations of midwives, and a body of written medical literature that was for its time genuinely impressive. The most important of those medical writers for our purposes tonight was a Greek physician named Soranus of Ephesus. Soranus practiced medicine in Rome during the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian, roughly from the late 1st century into the early 2nd century of the Common Era. He wrote a comprehensive medical text called Gynekaia, translated sometimes as gynecology, that is the most detailed surviving ancient source on obstetrics, midwifery, and women's health from the entire classical world. It is an extraordinary document. Soranus wrote about the qualities a good midwife should have. She should be literate, he said, so she could read medical texts. She should be calm under pressure. She should have strong, gentle hands. She should not be superstitious. Soranus was remarkably skeptical of the folk remedies and magical thinking that infected much ancient medicine. She should understand anatomy. He described the proper management of a normal delivery in careful detail. He described how to handle presentations where the baby was positioned incorrectly. He wrote about care for newborns, how to test whether a child was worth rearing, how to swaddle when, and how to begin feeding. He also wrote, and this is the part that made him unusual among ancient physicians, about women's bodies, not just in the context of reproduction, but as bodies with their own needs, their own rhythms, their own health conditions that mattered independently of whether they were currently pregnant. He argued, for instance, that menstruation was not, as many ancient writers believed, a toxic purging of bad blood, but a normal physiological process that did not require treatment unless it was causing symptoms. For the ancient world, that was a relatively enlightened position. But here is where I want to be careful not to paint too rosy a picture. Because Soranus, for all his comparative rationalism, was still operating within the framework of ancient medicine, and ancient medicine got a great deal wrong. The theory of the 4 humours, blood phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, underpinned virtually all Roman medical thinking. The idea was that health consisted of a balance between these 4 substances, and disease was an imbalance. For obstetrics, this meant that interventions were often based on this framework rather than on anything we would recognize as effective treatment. A woman running a fever after childbirth. What we now know is almost certainly a bacterial infection called puerperal fever. Caused by the introduction of bacteria during delivery, might be treated with dietary adjustments, bloodletting, or herbal preparations aimed at rebalancing her humours, none of which would do anything for a bacterial infection. The most famous victim of puerperal fever whose case we can document with reasonable confidence was not a Roman woman, but lived close enough in time that the same medical framework applied. Jane Seymour, the 3rd wife of Henry VIII of England, died 11 days after giving birth in 1537, 1700 years after the height of Roman civilization. The medicine had barely changed. That is how long it took for the human understanding of childbirth to catch up with the danger of it. Now let me tell you about a woman whose name I want you to remember. Her name was Scribonia. Not the Scribonia who was briefly married to Augustus, a different woman known to us solely through a funerary inscription found in Rome, dating to approximately the 1st century of the Common Era. The inscription was placed by her husband, and what he wrote has stayed with scholars ever since, not because it is elaborate or poetic, but because it is heartbreakingly plain. He wrote that Scribonia died in childbirth. He wrote that she was 19 years old. He wrote that she had tried to give him a son. And then this is the line that undoes me every time I read it. He wrote that the cruelty of fate had taken both of them together. Mother and child, 19 years old, one inscription, no more story. Funerary inscriptions are in some ways the most honest sources we have from the ancient world. They were not written for historians. They were not written to make political arguments or preserve a legacy. They were written by people in grief for people they had lost, in the hope that anyone walking past a stone in a cemetery might pause and acknowledge that this person had existed. And when we look at the Roman funerary record for women, the thousands of inscriptions that survive from across the empire, a pattern emerges that is both heartbreaking and revealing. A significant proportion of women commemorated in Roman funerary inscriptions died young, and a significant number of those inscriptions placed by husbands or fathers specifically mention childbirth as the cause. Some of them are formal, some of them are simple, and some of them carry a weight of feeling that breaks through the stone and reaches you across 2,000 years. One inscription found in North Africa reads, "She lived 27 years, 1 month, 12 days. She left behind twin sons and a husband who will mourn her always." Another from Rome itself, "To the sweetest and most deserving wife who lived with me for 18 years without a single quarrel." These were not great women of history. No one wrote books about them. No one erected statues. They were women who cooked dinner and raised children and managed households and loved people and were loved in return. And then in a room at the back of the house, they were gone. But Rome was not entirely without resources for women navigating pregnancy. There was contraception. Now, before you raise an eyebrow, yes, the ancient Romans thought about contraception. Soranus devoted a significant portion of his gynecological writings to it, and while the methods he described range from the practical to the deeply questionable to the genuinely bizarre, the fact that they existed at all tells us something important. Roman women, at least those with access to medical knowledge, were actively trying to manage their own reproduction. Soranus described several categories of contraceptive method. Some were barrier methods, wool pessaries soaked in various substances, including olive oil, white lead, and other materials inserted before intercourse. The olive oil component may have had some actual effect as a spermicide. The white lead was of course toxic, which is a reminder that ancient medicine could be its own form of danger. He also described the technique of holding one's breath at a critical moment and immediately jumping up and down afterward, which, to be clear, does not work, but does tell us something about the creative problem-solving available when you have no better options. More practically, Soranus described certain plants, particularly silphium, a plant from the coast of North Africa that was so valuable as a contraceptive among other uses that it was harvested to extinction by approximately the 1st century of the Common Era. We're not entirely sure how effective it was. We know it was wildly popular. We know it appeared on the coinage of the North African city of Cyrene because it was that economically important. And we know that once it was gone forever. One of the first documented cases of a species being wiped out by human demand. Partly because of its medicinal value. Partly because Roman women wanted it badly enough to pay for it. I want to ask you something, and I mean this sincerely. When you think about a woman in ancient Rome, if you let yourself really imagine her not as a figure in a textbook, but as a person waking up in the morning, what do you think she was most afraid of? Political invisibility, a controlling husband, the judgment of her neighbours, maybe all of those probably at different moments, but I think the answer that the historical evidence keeps returning to quietly and persistently is simpler and more physical than any of that. She was afraid of the room at the back of the house. She was afraid of her own body's capacity to betray her at the moment it was supposed to be most purposeful. She was afraid of becoming a stone in a cemetery with a few lines about how young she was and how much someone missed her. And yet, and this is the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing that I think is the actual story, underneath all the history she did it anyway. Not because she had no choice though, often she did not. But because bringing life into the world was for many Roman women an act of courage so ordinary and so repeated that it never even got named as courage. It was just Tuesday. It was just life. It was just what you did. The Romans honoured their dead with elaborate rituals. They believed the spirits of the deceased needed to be remembered to rest peacefully. They carved inscriptions and placed flowers and poured wine into the earth above graves on the anniversaries of deaths. The women who died in childbirth were remembered this way, honoured this way, grieved this way, and then their daughters grew up and faced the same room and the same fear and the same courage, generation after generation, in silence, in strength. The story of Roman women's bodies, their health, their danger, their knowledge, their quiet resistance is inseparable from the story of who served them in that room. Because the midwife was not just a medical practitioner, she was in many cases a slave, or a freedwoman, or a woman of such low social status that the law barely acknowledged her existence, and yet she held life and death in her hands. The women at the very bottom of Roman society, the ones with the least legal protection, the least visibility, the least of everything Rome valued, were the ones in the room when it mattered most. That story, the story of working women, slave women, the women Rome built on and never named, is exactly where we go next. And it is, I think, one of the most important parts of everything we're telling tonight. Stay with me. Walk with me for a moment. Not through the Forum, not past the Senate House or the temples or the triumphal arches that every tourist photograph captures. Walk with me through the streets that ran alongside those monuments, the narrow ones, the ones that smelled of bread baking and fish sauce and fresh-cut wood, and the particular sharp scent of a fuller's workshop where clothes were cleaned in, and I apologise for this in advance, fermented urine. Rome collected urine in large clay pots on street corners for this purpose. It contains ammonia. It works. And somebody had to manage that process. That somebody was often a woman. This is the Rome that rarely gets the documentary treatment. The Rome that wasn't marble and speeches. The Rome of the tabernae, the small street-facing shops that lined virtually every major street in every Roman city. Their wide counters open to the pavement selling food and wine and goods and services from first light until the carts began rolling again after dark. And in those tabernae, behind those counters, working those ovens, managing those supply chains in miniature women. Everywhere. Working. Named sometimes. Almost always forgotten. Let's talk about what we actually know. Because this is not speculation. Roman funerary inscriptions, those same honest little monuments we keep returning to throughout this story, are one of our richest sources for understanding what ordinary Roman women did for work. And what they tell us when you read enough of them is stunning in its variety. We have inscriptions identifying women as pistrix female bakers, as sutrix female cobblers, as negotiatrix female merchants, a word that carries real commercial weight, not just the suggestion of small-scale trading, as pharmacopoeia female pharmacists or medicine sellers, as obstetrics midwives, which we have already discussed, but whose professional identity was significant enough that women wore it proudly on their tombstones, as tonstrix female barbers, as piscatrix female fish sellers, as medica female physicians. That last one deserves a pause. Female physicians. Not healers in an informal sense. Not women who knew a few herbal remedies. Women who identified themselves on their own funerary monuments with the Latin word for doctor. We have at least 6 inscriptions from across the Roman world identifying women as medica from Rome itself, from Lyon in what is now France, from the eastern provinces. One of the most remarkable is an inscription from Rome commemorating a woman named Matilia Donata, who is described as a medica. Another from the city of Metz in what is now northeastern France honours a woman named Attilia Procula, also identified as a physician. These were not anomalies hidden in footnotes. They were real women who practiced medicine, who were remembered for it, and who apparently saw their professional identity as important enough to carry into death. The Roman medical establishment was, broadly speaking, not a credentialed institution in the way we think of medicine today. There were no medical schools issuing degrees, no licensing boards, Medicine was learned through apprenticeship, through reading, through practice, and that relatively open structure, however, unintentionally created spaces where women could enter. They entered. But the working world of Roman women was not only about individual professions. It was embedded in the physical structure of Roman cities in ways that archaeology has only recently begun to fully appreciate. In Pompeii, that endlessly generous archaeological site, researchers mapping the distribution of businesses across the city have found something that cuts against the traditional image of Roman economic life as entirely male-dominated. When they trace property ownership records, business signage, and the physical evidence of who actually lived and worked in the commercial spaces of the city, women appear with striking frequency. Not as owners' wives hovering in the background, as operators, as the people whose names appear on the walls, whose social networks connected the business to its customers, whose presence was the business. One of the most studied examples is a woman named Asalina, whose thermopolium, essentially a Roman fast food counter, serving hot food and drinks from a counter, with built-in containers that archaeologists still find preserved, bore her name on its external wall. More than that, electoral graffiti on the wall outside her establishment lists the names of several women associated with her business, Smyrna Maria Egel, who apparently campaigned for local political candidates. Women associated with a commercial establishment engaging publicly in the political life of their city. Not voting. Rome did not allow that, but canvassing, persuading, making their preferences known in the most public way available to them. The distinction between what was forbidden and what actually happened in Roman civic life was often considerable. Now I want to take you somewhere very different. From the noise and smoke of the street-level economy up to one of the most rarefied and peculiar institutions in all of Roman religion, the Vestal Virgins, 6 women. That was the full complement at any given time. 6 women selected in childhood between the ages of 6 and 10 from among Rome's most prominent families, chosen by the chief priest of Rome, the Pontifex Maximus, in a ceremony that deliberately echoed the language of a father handing over a daughter in marriage. They served for 30 years. For those 30 years they lived in the house of the Vestals, a large comfortable residence in the Roman Forum, right in the centre of public life, surrounded by temples and government buildings and the constant traffic of Roman political existence. Their sacred duty was to maintain the eternal flame burning in the temple of Vesta, not to let it go out under any circumstances. The fire was understood to be in a very direct and literal sense the fire of Rome itself. If it died, Rome was in danger. A Vestal who allowed the fire to go out was punished by flogging. That sounds severe. The other punishment was worse. A Vestal who broke her vow of chastity, or who was accused of breaking it, which was not always the same thing, faced a punishment that Rome reserved for this crime alone. She was buried alive, in a small underground chamber called the Campus Sceleratus, the field of wickedness just inside the city walls. She was given a small amount of food and a lamp. The entrance was sealed. Rome could not technically execute a Vestal with its own hands. That would be impious, a violation of her sacred person. So instead it gave her the means of survival and let fate or the gods take over. It is one of the most chilling legal fictions in Roman history. We know of at least 10 Vestals who met this fate over the course of Roman history. Some of them were almost certainly innocent, their prosecutions timed suspiciously well, with political crises that required a scapegoat. In one case, in 114 and 113, before the Common Era, 3 Vestals were condemned simultaneously, an event so unusual that ancient historians themselves questioned whether all 3 could really have been guilty. The Vestals were in a very real sense political hostages to Rome's sense of divine favour. When things went wrong, military defeats, natural disasters, political upheaval, The instinct to look at the sacred women and ask whether they had failed in their duty was never far away. But here is the other side of the Vestal story. The side that gets overlooked when people focus only on the flame and the punishments. Vestal virgins held more legal power than almost any other women and many men in the entire Roman world. They were legally independent. They did not require a guardian. They could own property in their own names. They could make wills and inherit freely. They could conduct legal transactions without male oversight. In a legal system that treated adult women as permanent dependents, this was extraordinary. They sat in places of honor at public events, at the gladiatorial games, at theatrical performances, at public ceremonies in seats reserved for the most senior officials of the state. Their testimony in legal proceedings carried exceptional weight. Their intercession could save a condemned man's life. A Vestal walking past a criminal on his way to execution could by custom grant him a pardon simply by her presence. Emperors entrusted their wills to the Vestal's keeping. The most important state documents were sometimes stored in the Temple of Vesta for safekeeping. These 6 women who lived under extraordinary restrictions and extraordinary dangers simultaneously occupied a position of genuine public power that no other Roman women could access. It is one of the great paradoxes of Roman religious life. The most honored women in Rome were also among the most controlled. Their power was entirely contingent on their compliance. Step outside the boundary or be accused of stepping outside it, and everything was reversed in the most violent way imaginable. Power given by the state. Power that could be taken away in the most brutal manner the state could devise. The same bargain in extreme form that Rome offered to women at every level of its society. Let me bring you back down to the street, because there is one category of working women in Rome that I have been deliberately leaving until now, not because it is unimportant, because it requires care. Prostitution in ancient Rome was legal, regulated, taxed, and widespread. We know this from multiple sources, from legal texts that define the categories of women who practiced it, from the physical evidence of Roman brothels that archaeology has identified in Pompeii, and elsewhere from the graffiti that covered their walls, from the tax records that treated the income as a legitimate revenue stream. The Roman state collected a tax on every transaction, even under emperors who publicly championed moral reform, even under Augustus, who banned adultery while simultaneously taxing the profession that existed partly because adultery was banned. The contradictions of Roman moral policy could be spectacular. What I want to focus on, though, is something the conventional discussion of this topic often misses. The women who worked in this industry were overwhelmingly not there by choice. We have already established in an earlier part of our story tonight that many of them were slaves sold into brothels. Others were exposed children, abandoned infants raised specifically for this purpose by whoever picked them up from the street. But there was also a third category that Roman law documented with uncomfortable precision: women who had fallen into debt, women whose families had collapsed, women who were freed slaves with no resources and no connections, women for whom the alternatives were quite simply worse. Roman law required women in this profession to register with the aediles, the municipal officials responsible for public order. Registration was permanent. Once registered, a woman was legally and famous stripped of her status as a respectable person for the rest of her life. Even if she stopped, even if she married, even if she spent the next 40 years as a devoted wife and mother. The registration followed her. The law, in other words, created a one-way door. You could enter that category. You could not leave it. I find myself thinking when I read this part of Roman history about the distance between how Rome described itself and what Rome actually was. Rome described itself as the bearer of civilization, of law, of order, of virtue, and in many ways it was. The legal sophistication, the infrastructure, the philosophical tradition, the literary culture, these were real achievements, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But civilization in Rome, as everywhere, had a foundation, and that foundation was built by people whose labour was not freely given, whose lives were not their own, and whose contributions were absorbed into the grand imperial project without credit, without protection, and without memory. The working women of Rome, the bakers, and the physicians, and the merchants, and the midwives, and the vestals, and the women at the absolute bottom of the social order, they were the foundation. Every grand building Rome ever raised stood on the work of people like them, and most of their names are gone. But not all of them. Some names survived, not because Rome chose to remember them, but because the stone outlasted the people who wanted to forget. And the names that survived lead us inevitably to the part of Roman history that has always fascinated people the most. The top, the women who moved in the circles of emperors, who shaped the course of the empire through whispers and strategy, and the particular kind of power that has no official title but is completely real. Women like Livia, like Agrippina, like Julia Domna. Women Rome called monsters when it wanted to control the story, and women who, when you look past the monster-making, reveal something far more interesting and far more human than any monster could be. That is where we are headed next. Hold on. This part of the story is going to move fast, and it is going to surprise you. Before we climb to the top, before we talk about empresses and imperial power, and the women who shaped the fate of an empire, I need to bring you somewhere uncomfortable first. Not because I enjoy discomfort, but because the story of Roman women cannot be told honestly if we skip this part. And this part is the foundation that everything else rested on. Somewhere between 25 and 35% of the population of Roman Italy during the height of the empire were enslaved. Let that number settle for a moment. 1 in every 3 or 4 people, not in one particular region, not in one particular industry, across the entire social fabric of Roman life. In the households we've been visiting all evening, the ones with the educated daughters and the well-managed kitchens and the wax tablets recording financial transactions, the people doing most of the physical work were enslaved. The woman who combed the mistress's hair, the woman who nursed the infant, the woman who kneaded the bread before the household woke up, the woman who cleaned the floors, carried the water, emptied the chamber pots, and then started all over again the next morning. These women were not employees. They were not servants in the modern sense. They were property. Legally, completely, without qualification. Roman law was extraordinarily detailed about a great many things, and one of the things it was most detailed about was the legal status of enslaved people. An enslaved person in Roman law was classified as a res a thing, a category that also included furniture, livestock, and land. The legal consequences of this classification were total. An enslaved person could not own property, could not enter into a legal contract, could not marry, not in the legal sense, because marriage in Rome was a legal institution, and legal institutions required legal persons to participate in them. An enslaved person could not testify in a Roman court except under torture, the theory being that only pain could guarantee honesty from someone who had no stake in the legal system. And an enslaved woman had no legal recourse against anything done to her by her owner. None. I want to be careful here because this is history and history deserves precision. Not every enslaved woman in Rome lived in identical conditions. The range of experience within Roman slavery was vast, from the trusted household manager who effectively ran an estate and had her own small savings and her own network of relationships, to the woman labouring in a Roman mine in Spain or North Africa under conditions so brutal that life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. What determined where on that spectrum an enslaved woman fell was largely a combination of what skills she had, who her owner was, what city or province she lived in, and the randomness of circumstances that no one controlled. An enslaved woman who had medical skills, or who was a skilled weaver, or who spoke Greek and Latin and could serve as a secretary or a tutor, that woman had a different daily reality than an enslaved woman with no specialized skills in a large agricultural estate. Different. Not free, not protected, not safe, but different. And the Roman sources, when we dig into them carefully, give us glimpses of that difference that are important to acknowledge. We have evidence of enslaved women who saved money through the small allowance some owners permitted, called the peculium, and eventually purchased their own freedom. We have evidence of enslaved women who formed lasting partnerships that their owners and communities recognized in practice, even if Roman law refused to recognize in theory. We have evidence of enslaved women who were trusted enough to be given significant responsibility, managing households, managing finances, managing other enslaved people in ways that gave them real day-to-day authority, even without legal standing. And we have evidence in funerary inscriptions and in wills and in private letters of genuine feeling between enslaved people and the free families they served. I say this not to soften the horror of the institution, but because history is complicated, and because the women who lived inside this system were complicated human beings navigating impossible circumstances with the full range of intelligence, feeling strategy, and hope that human beings always bring to impossible circumstances. They were not simply victims, they were people. Let me tell you about one of them. Her name was Pallas. Not the famous male freedman Pallas who served Emperor Claudius, a different person entirely. This Pallas was an enslaved woman whose story we know from a funerary inscription found in Rome dated to the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. The inscription was set up by a man who identified himself as her patron, which in Roman terminology meant he was the person who had formerly owned her and had since freed her. He described her as his alumna, that word again the foundling child, which suggests she may have been raised in his household from infancy. He described her as faithful, hard-working, and devoted. He described her death as a loss he felt deeply, and then he listed what she had accomplished in the years after her freedom. She had apparently established a small household of her own. She had savings. She had connections. She had, in the years between her manumission and her death, built something that looked from the outside like a modest but real version of the life that freeborn Roman women of her class lived. The inscription does not tell us how long it took. It does not tell us what the years of enslavement were like. It gives us only the ending and the fact that someone thought that ending was worth recording in stone. I find myself wanting to know more about Pallas than the stone can tell me. I suspect she was someone worth knowing. The pathway from slavery to freedom in Rome manumission was real, and it was compared to many later slaveholding societies relatively accessible. Roman law provided multiple mechanisms for an owner to free an enslaved person, through a will, through a formal ceremony, through a simple declaration in front of witnesses. Some owners freed enslaved people out of genuine affection. Some did it because an aging enslaved person was more expensive to maintain than their productivity justified. Some did it as a reward for years of service structured almost like a pension. And some enslaved people, as we have seen, bought their own freedom with saved peculium. The freed person, the libertus or liberta, occupied a specific and interesting position in Roman society. They were not fully free in the modern sense. They owed ongoing obligations to their former owner, the patronus, including certain forms of labour and loyalty. But they were free people. They could own property. They could marry legally. They could conduct business. Their children, any children born after manumission, were born free. That last detail was significant. A freed enslaved woman who had children after her manumission was not just freeing herself, she was freeing her line. Every child born to her from that point forward entered the world with legal personhood. In a society built on inherited status that was a transformation of enormous consequence. And many freed women pursued it with everything they had. We see the evidence of this in one of the most unexpected places, the Roman freedwoman's grave. Across the Roman world, archaeologists have found a disproportionately high number of elaborate funerary monuments erected by and for freed enslaved people, particularly in the late Republic and early Imperial period. These monuments were not modest. Some of them were quite grand-carved reliefs showing the deceased in their finest clothes, sometimes holding the tools of their trade, sometimes simply posed in the manner of respectable Roman citizens. Historians have suggested several reasons for this. One is purely practical freed people often accumulated money in trade and commerce in the spaces of the Roman economy that freeborn citizens of higher status sometimes considered beneath their dignity. But another reason, I think, is more human. These were people who had spent part of their lives as legal non-persons, as res, as things. The funerary monument was among other things a declaration. I existed. I was a person. I had a face and a name and a life. I built something. I was here. You know what I keep thinking about going through all of this? I keep thinking about the distance between the official story and the lived story. The official story of Rome said that these women, the enslaved ones, the freed ones, the ones working in the tabernae and carrying water and nursing other people's children barely existed. The lived story written in stone and ink and papyrus and wax and the stubborn persistence of archaeology says something completely different. They existed everywhere. They did everything. They kept the whole enormous machine running, and the machine never once said thank you. There is one more dimension of enslaved women's lives in Rome that I want to touch on because it speaks to something profound about the human capacity for meaning-making under impossible conditions. Religion. Enslaved people in Rome had access to religious life in ways that the legal system, for all its thoroughness, could not entirely control. The mystery religions, the cult of Isis imported from Egypt, the worship of Cybele from Asia Minor, the Mithric traditions and eventually Christianity spread through the Roman world, partly through the networks of enslaved and freed people. These were religions that in different ways made promises that Roman official religion did not. The cult of Isis in particular was notable for the relative equality it offered its worshippers. In the Temple of Isis, the legal distinctions of Roman society free and slave citizen and foreigner man and woman were not the operative categories. The operative category was devotion. We have evidence of enslaved women participating in Isis worship, of freed women holding priestly roles in Isis communities, of women at the very bottom of the Roman social hierarchy finding in a temple dedicated to an Egyptian goddess something that Roman civic life never offered them. Recognition, community, a sense that their inner life mattered. The historian Keith Hopkins, writing about religion and slavery in the Roman world, noted that the popularity of mystery religions among enslaved and freed people was not simply about theology, it was about belonging. In a world that had legally classified you as a thing, finding a community that treated you as a soul was not a small matter. It was everything. I want to close this chapter with an image that has stayed with me. In the ruins of Herculaneum, the other city destroyed by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 of the Common Era, often overshadowed by Pompeii, but in some ways even better preserved archaeologists made a discovery in the 1980s that stopped everyone cold. In the boat chambers along the ancient seafront arch storage spaces that the fleeing population had crowded into when the eruption began, they found skeletons. Hundreds of them. People who had not made it. Among them, Archaeologists identified the remains of a young woman. She was wearing gold jewelry earrings, bracelet rings. She was carrying a small wooden box that had mostly disintegrated, but whose metal fittings survived. And inside the remnants of that box were gold coins. She was not wealthy, the jewelry was good, but not extraordinary, the coins significant, but not a fortune. But here is the thing that made the archaeologist pause. The jewelry she was wearing was not the kind of jewelry freeborn Roman women typically wore in that style and combination. The type and arrangement suggested to the specialists who examined it that she was almost certainly an enslaved woman, running for her life, carrying her gold, not her owner's gold, hers, her peculium, the savings she had accumulated coin by coin in the years of her service, the money that was going to buy her freedom. She did not make it out of Herculaneum, but she had been trying. Right up until the very end she had been trying to get free. That image, a woman running toward freedom with her savings in a box, the mountain exploding behind her, feels to me like the truest possible symbol of what we've been talking about all evening. Not the official story, not the marble and the monuments, the human story, the one that keeps pushing against every boundary placed in front of it, the one that refuses even at the last moment to stop reaching. And now, having spent this chapter with the women at the foundation of a Roman society, we finally climb to where we have been heading all along, to the women at the very top. Because if you think the powerless women of Rome had complicated lives, wait until you hear about the powerful ones. The women who sat in the shadow of emperors and moved entire armies without holding a single official rank. Women who were celebrated as goddesses while they lived, and destroyed as monsters the moment it became politically convenient. The story of imperial women in Rome is one of the most psychologically fascinating case studies in the entire history of power. And it starts with one woman who may have been the most quietly brilliant political operator in Roman history. Her name was Livia, and she spent 51 years shaping the most powerful empire the world had ever seen without ever holding a single official title. Livia Drusilla was 19 years old when the world changed around her. The year was 42 before the Common Era. Rome was tearing itself apart. The civil wars that had been bleeding the Republic dry for decades had reached a new phase of violence, and her husband at the time, a man named Tiberius Claudius Nero, had backed the wrong side. They fled Rome, with a small child, through hostile territory. At one point, according to the historian Suetonius Forests, they were passing through caught fire, and Livia's hair and clothing were singed by the flames before they escaped. She was 19 years old, running through burning woods with a baby because her husband had made a political miscalculation. 2 years later, she met the man who had become Rome's first emperor. His name was Gaius Octavius. History would call him Augustus. And the moment he saw Livia at a dinner, by most accounts, when both of them were still technically married to other people, something shifted. He divorced his pregnant wife. He arranged for Livia's husband to divorce her also while she was pregnant so recently, in fact, that ancient sources noted with obvious discomfort that her former husband attended the wedding and gave her away like a father 3 months before she gave birth to her second son. Roman society raised its collective eyebrow. Augustus did not care. He married Livia in 38 before the Common Era. He stayed married to her for 51 years until his death in 14 of the Common Era. In those 51 years, she became the most powerful woman Rome had ever produced, without a single official title. What did Livia's power actually look like? This is the question historians have debated for 2,000 years, and I think the debate itself is revealing. Because the sources we have, primarily the historian Tacitus, writing about a century after Livia's death, and the biographer Suetonius are not neutral. Tacitus in particular wrote about Livia with a kind of wary, reluctant respect, mixed with unmistakable hostility. He described her as having a mother's hold over Augustus, a phrase that sounds like a compliment, but isn't quite because it frames her influence as something emotional and domestic, rather than political and intellectual. He called her a real catastrophe for the Roman world, in the context of her influence over her son Tiberius, who became emperor after Augustus's death. And yet, and this is the contradiction at the heart of every ancient account of Livia, the same sources that describe her in these loaded terms also provide evidence that completely contradicts the picture of a scheming, manipulative woman operating through emotional leverage. They describe her managing correspondence on behalf of Augustus, receiving foreign dignitaries, conducting her own independent financial operations on a scale that made her one of the wealthiest individuals in the empire, owning property across Italy and in the eastern provinces, running workshops that produced the famous Livian bricks Opus Doliae stamped with her name, traded commercially used in construction projects across the Roman world. Livia had a brick business, an actual commercially active, profitable brick manufacturing operation. The Empress of Rome had a brick business. I find that detail delightful for reasons I cannot entirely explain. But it also tells you something important. Livia did not understand her power as purely social or political. She understood it as economic. She built it into the physical infrastructure of the empire she helped her husband create. Augustus, for his part, appears to have genuinely consulted her. We have a remarkable piece of evidence for this in a passage from the historian Cassius Dio, who records possibly drawing on an actual document what purports to be Augustus consulting Livia on a matter of clemency toward a political enemy. The exchange, whether historically precise or somewhat reconstructed, shows Livia making a sophisticated political argument. She essentially tells Augustus that showing mercy will serve his long-term interests better than punishment, that the appearance of confidence and security, not the demonstration of force, is what consolidates power. It is whatever its precise historical accuracy, a recognizable piece of high-level political reasoning. The kind of reasoning that gets attributed to Machiavelli as genius when a man articulates it. In Livia's case, it was recorded and then mostly forgotten in the footnotes of histories about her husband. After Augustus died, Livia's position shifted in ways that revealed exactly how Rome managed powerful women. Augustus in his will had adopted her posthumously into the Julian family, making her officially Julia Augusta. He also left her 1/3 of his entire estate. His successor, her son Tiberius, gave her the title of Augusta, the first Roman woman to hold it as a formal designation. But Tiberius, who had a relationship with his mother that the ancient sources describe as deeply complicated by something approaching mutual resentment, spent much of his reign trying to limit her public role. He refused to allow the Senate to vote her the title Mother of the Fatherland. He blocked various other honours. He reportedly found her presence and her influence intolerable. Partly one suspects because she knew him too well and had too much leverage and was not willing to simply disappear into dignified retirement. When Livia died in 29 of the Common Era at around 86 years of age, an extraordinary lifespan for the ancient world by any measure, Tiberius did not return to Rome for her funeral. He claimed he was too busy. He also did not carry out the provisions of her will for some years, and the divine honours that Augustus had apparently suggested for her Tiberius blocked those too. She was deified eventually, but not until the reign of her grandson Claudius 13 years after her death. Make of that what you will. Now let's talk about Agrippina the Younger. Because if Livia was the model of how Roman imperial women could accumulate and exercise power, quietly, strategically, patiently over decades, Agrippina the Younger was what happened when a woman with equal ambition and superior intelligence decided she was done being quiet. Agrippina was born in 15 of the Common Era, the daughter of the beloved general Germanicus, and the elder Agrippina herself, a formidable woman who has her own extraordinary story. She grew up inside the imperial family. She watched her mother clash with Tiberius and eventually be exiled and die under circumstances that were almost certainly not natural. She watched her brothers be destroyed one by one. She survived. And in surviving, she learned something that very few people in Roman history, male or female, ever really mastered. She learned how the machine worked, every gear, every lever, every point at which a well-placed word or a carefully cultivated relationship or a strategically timed action could redirect the entire mechanism. By the time her brother Caligula became emperor, she was already a significant political figure. She navigated his reign no small feat given that Caligula was erratic and dangerous, and survived his assassination. She survived the chaotic transition to Claudius, and then she married Claudius, her own uncle. This required a special senatorial decree permitting uncle-niece marriage, which had previously been illegal under Roman law. The Senate passed it. Within 4 years, her son from her first marriage was adopted by Claudius, given the name Nero, and positioned as the heir to the empire over Claudius's own biological son Britannicus. In the year 54 of the Common Era, Claudius died. The ancient sources are divided on the cause: natural illness, or something introduced into a dish of mushrooms at dinner. Agrippina has been the primary suspect for nearly 2,000 years, but here is the thing I want to say about that accusation because I think it matters. We do not know. The ancient sources that describe Agrippina as a murderer are not unbiased observers. They are primarily writers working under or after the reign of Nero, a man who had every reason to want his mother portrayed as a monster, particularly after he had her killed. Yes, Nero had his own mother executed in 59 of the Common Era. The official story was that she had plotted against him. The actual story was more likely that she had become too independent, too publicly influential, and too willing to challenge decisions she disagreed with. She was 43 years old, and when the assassins arrived, according to one account preserved by the historian Tacitus, who again was not a neutral source, but at least was trying to tell a coherent story, she reportedly opened her robe and told them to strike at her womb, the womb that had produced the emperor who was killing her. Whether that account is precise or embellished or invented, it has the ring of something. It has the ring of a woman who at the very end was not going to perform the expected emotions, not begging, not shrinking. Just the terrible arithmetic of what she had built and what it had cost her. I want to stop and ask you something genuinely. When you read about women like Agrippina, women who operated in extraordinarily dangerous environments, who used every tool available to them, who made alliances and broke them, and accumulated power in ways that the official record found transgressive, what is your instinct? Admiration, discomfort? A complicated mixture of both. I think the discomfort is worth examining, because the words Rome used to describe ambitious women scheming manipulative, sexually transgressive, unnatural, are not neutral historical observations. They are the vocabulary of a society that found female ambition threatening and needed language to contain it. Agrippina did not do anything that ambitious Roman men did not also do. She formed alliances. She advanced the interests of her family. She accumulated influence. She protected herself in a lethal environment. The difference was not what she did. The difference was that she was a woman. And so what looked like politics in a man looked like conspiracy in her. The pattern we see in Livia and Agrippina repeated itself with variations throughout Roman imperial history. Julia Domna, the Syrian-born wife of Emperor Septimius Severus, who reigned from 193 to 211 of the Common Era, was by multiple contemporary accounts one of the most intellectually formidable women of the entire imperial period. She assembled a literary and philosophical circle that included some of the leading thinkers of her day. She travelled with the army on campaign, a remarkable departure from convention. She managed correspondence and policy matters for her husband. She was granted the title Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Military Camps, an honour with genuine political resonance, not merely a symbolic gesture. After her husband's death, and then the death of one of her sons at the hands of the other, a civil war compressed into a single family, as Roman history so often was, Julia Domna reportedly chose to stop eating. She died shortly after. Some ancient sources called it illness, others called it a deliberate choice. A woman who had exercised more real power than most emperors' advisors, who had spent 30 years at the centre of Roman imperial administration, who had watched her family destroy itself, choosing at the end the one domain that remained entirely hers, her own body, her own exit. The story that connects Livia and Agrippina and Julia Domna and the dozens of other imperial women whose names appear in the sources is not a story about good women and bad women. It is not a story about monsters and saints. It is a story about what happens when people of genuine intelligence and capability are placed inside a system that simultaneously needs their talents and refuses to officially acknowledge them. They find ways. They always find ways. And the system, which cannot admit that it needs them, has no choice but to call what they do by names that make it sound illegitimate. Scheming, manipulating, poisoning. The myth of the bad empress is not a historical truth. It is a coping mechanism, a way for Rome and for the historians who wrote about Rome to manage the uncomfortable evidence that the empire was in significant part run by women who were not supposed to exist. We've now travelled from the very top of Roman society to very near its bottom and back again. We've walked through palaces and birthing rooms and funerary chambers and street-level shops. We've met women who bent empires and women who ran away from burning mountains with their savings in a wooden box. And through all of it, there is one place we've not yet visited, a place that was for many Roman women the most important space in their entire lives. Not the household, not the marketplace, not the imperial court, the sacred space, the temple, the ritual, the religious community. Because Roman women had access to something in their religious lives that they were denied almost everywhere else. A room of their own, a place where the rules of the outside world could not entirely follow them, and some of what they did in that room, or rather what they scratched onto thin sheets of lead and dropped into sacred springs and cursed rivers, is some of the most raw, unfiltered and genuinely human evidence that survives from the entire ancient world. We're almost at the end of our journey tonight, but not quite yet. Somewhere in Roman Britain, in the city the Romans called Aquaesulis, the city we now call Bath, there is a spring. It has been there for thousands of years, hot water rising from deep underground, naturally heated by geothermal activity, to a steady temperature of 46 degrees Celsius, emerging from the earth into a pool that the Romans enclosed in stone, decorated with carved stone, and dedicated to the goddess Sulis Minerva, a fusion of the local Celtic deity Sulis and the Roman Minerva goddess of wisdom and craft. Pilgrims came from across the province of Britannia to visit this spring. They threw offerings into the sacred water, coins mostly, jewellery sometimes, personal objects of meaning, and something else. Something that archaeologists began pulling from the sediment of that ancient pool in 1979. Something so unexpected and so perfectly preserved by the mineral-rich water that it rewrote what historians understood about the inner lives of ordinary Roman people. Cursed tablets, thin sheets of pewter and lead no larger than a postcard rolled or folded and thrown into the sacred water, with the force of someone who was absolutely done being calm about something. More than 130 of them were found at Bath alone, written in Latin, sometimes carefully, sometimes in the rushed hand of someone with a lot of feeling and limited patience for penmanship, addressed to the goddess, asking her to intervene, to punish, to right a wrong that the Roman legal system for whatever reason was not fixing, and a striking number of them were written by women. Now, before I tell you what the Beth tablets actually say, I want to give you a moment to appreciate what they represent, because this is genuinely rare in ancient history. Most of what we know about Roman women comes filtered through men. Men wrote the histories, men wrote the laws, men wrote the literature, the philosophy, the medical texts. Even the funerary inscriptions we've talked about all evening, most of them were written by husbands or fathers or sons. They tell us what the men around these women chose to record. The curse tablets are different. They are women writing in their own words for their own purposes, with no intermediary, and no audience except a goddess who they believed would actually listen. They are the closest thing we have to an unfiltered Roman woman's voice. And what those voices say is, I want to be careful here, not entirely what you might expect. Some of the tablets are about theft. A woman named Aciliana writing at Bath addressed the goddess to report that someone had stolen her hooded cloak. She asked Sulis Minerva to ensure that the thief, whether man or woman, slave or free, should not be permitted to sleep or eat or drink until they returned what was taken. Another woman, whose name is partially illegible, but whose scholars transcribe as beginning with the letters Sartu, reported the theft of a silver ring, and asked the goddess to take from the thief the thing they valued most. Their eyes, she specified. The thing they valued most was their eyes. The directness of that is something. But then there are the tablets that go somewhere more personal, more raw. A woman named Ursa, which simply means she-bear, a common enough Roman name, wrote to the goddess about a man. The tablet does not give us enough detail to reconstruct the full story, but the tone is unmistakable. She had been wronged, not robbed of property, wronged in the way that leaves a person lying awake at night cataloguing exactly how, and by whom, and to what precise degree. She asked the goddess to ensure that this man would know no peace, that whatever plans he made would fail, that what he had taken from her, and here the Latin becomes ambiguous in ways that scholars have debated, but the emotional content is clear, would cost him more than he had gained. This is not a petty grievance. This is someone who had no other recourse, no court she could easily access, no public forum where her complaint would be heard, no authority she could appeal to with any confidence of being taken seriously. So she went to the goddess. She wrote it down, she threw it into the sacred water, and she trusted that something somewhere was paying attention. What strikes me most about the curse tablets, and I have spent more time than I probably should thinking about this, is not the anger. The anger makes complete sense. The anger is human and recognizable and honest. What strikes me is the theology underneath it. These women believed the goddess would act on their behalf, not eventually, not in some abstract afterlife accounting, now, in this life, against this specific person who had taken this specific thing. That is a very different relationship with divinity than the official Roman state religion offered. The official Roman religion, the public cults, the state sacrifices, the great temples, was at its core a transaction between the Roman community and the gods. You sacrifice the gods, protect Rome. You maintain the rituals, the gods maintain the harvest. The military victories, the civic order. It was a civic religion, a group religion, a religion about the collective. It did not offer much to an individual woman whose cloak had been stolen and whose legal options were limited. The mystery religions filled that gap, and no mystery religion filled it more completely or with more particular appeal to women than the cult of Isis. Isis was an Egyptian goddess, part of a religious tradition thousands of years older than Rome, who was imported into the Roman world in the late Republic and spread with extraordinary speed through the Mediterranean. By the 1st century of the Common Era, temples dedicated to Isis existed in Rome itself, in Pompeii, in Corinth, in cities across the eastern provinces and in communities along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. She was worshipped as a goddess of many things: magic, healing the dead, the sea, motherhood, the moon. But the aspect of her mythology that I think explains her extraordinary appeal, particularly to women, is simpler than any of those attributes. Isis was a devoted wife who searched the entire world for her husband. She was a mother who protected her child against impossible odds. She was a goddess who had suffered and mourned and persevered. She was, in other words, someone who understood, not the abstract, distant understanding of a sky god dispensing justice from above, the intimate, earned understanding of someone who had been through something, and her cult reflected that intimacy. Initiation into the mysteries of Isis involved ritual personal transformation and a direct religious experience that its participants described as profoundly moving. The Roman author Apuleius, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, described in his novel The Golden Ass an initiation experience involving darkness light and the sense of standing in the presence of the goddess herself. He described emerging from that experience as a kind of rebirth. Whether you read Apuleius as literal or metaphorical or somewhere between, the emotional truth of what he describes is clear. This was a religion that offered its participants something personal, something that belonged to them, something that the state cults with their civic focus and their male priesthood simply did not provide. And then there was the Bona Dea, the good goddess. Her true name was never publicly spoken. In the official Roman tradition, she was simply called the Bona Dea, the good goddess, and her real identity was one of the most closely guarded religious secrets in Rome. Her annual festival, held in December, was one of the most strictly sex-segregated events in the entire Roman religious calendar. No men allowed. None. Not even male animals. Paintings of male animals in the hosting household were reportedly covered for the duration of the ceremony. The festival was hosted by the wife of a senior Roman magistrate, a position of considerable social prestige. The Vestal Virgins attended. The leading women of Roman society gathered. And what happened inside that house behind those closed doors with all the men of Rome firmly on the outside was entirely theirs. We do not know exactly what they did. The men who wrote about it did not know either, which frustrated them enormously, and which is frankly one of the most satisfying details in all of Roman history. We know there was wine. We know there was music. We know there were rituals involving herbs and sacred objects. We know it was serious and important and fiercely protected, and we know this because in 62 before the Common Era, a man named Publius Clodius Pulcher, the same brother of Clodia Metelli we met earlier in our story, disguised himself as a woman and infiltrated the ceremony apparently to meet with Julius Caesar's wife. He was discovered. He was prosecuted for sacrilege. The scandal rocked Rome. Caesar famously divorced his wife not because he believed she'd done anything wrong, but because, as he reportedly said, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. Which is one of the more memorable deflections in the history of marriage. But the point for our purposes is this. The violation of the Bona Dea ceremony was considered a genuine religious and political crisis, not a minor social embarrassment, a crisis. Because what happened in that room mattered, even to people, especially to people who were not allowed inside it. Now let me ask you something. When was the last time you had a space that was entirely yours? Not physically, not just a room, though a room matters, but a space where the rules that governed everywhere else did not quite apply, where you could say what you actually felt, where you were not being evaluated or managed or observed by someone with authority over you. For Roman women, particularly those at the middle and lower levels of society, women who move through their daily lives always under some form of oversight, always aware of what was expected of them and what would happen if they failed to provide it. The sacred space was that room, the temple, the mystery rite, the cult meeting, the moment of prayer at a roadside shrine. These were not just religious experiences in the abstract theological sense. They were the spaces where Roman women got to be fully themselves, where Ursa could be angry without consequence, where Dociliana could demand justice for her stolen cloak, where the women of Rome could gather without men and do whatever it was they did in there behind the covered paintings with their wine and their herbs and their rituals that no one else was allowed to see. And then there is the Rhine. The Roman frontier along the Rhine River in what is now Germany and the Netherlands was for several centuries one of the most heavily militarized zones in the empire. Legionary fortresses, auxiliary camps, supply depots, a long tense border between Roman civilization and the Germanic world beyond. And scattered along that frontier in the shrines and sacred spaces associated with local and Roman deities, archaeologists have found curse tablets, not as many as at Bath, but enough, and among them written by soldiers and traders and local civilians and the women attached to all these communities, some of the most startlingly personal documents from the entire Roman frontier experience. One tablet found in the region of what is now the Netherlands was written by a woman who identified herself in relation to a man, probably her husband or partner, who had wronged her in a financial matter. She asked the deity to make him unable to sleep, unable to work, unable to conduct the business that he had conducted at her expense. She asked for the accounting to be corrected, not dramatically, not violently. She asked for the accounting to be corrected. That phrase has stayed with me, because it is so specific, so precise, so focused on what had actually happened, not on abstract justice, but on the particular number that was wrong, the particular balance that had been tipped, the particular correction that would make things right. This was not a woman expressing generalized grievance. This was a woman who understood exactly what she was owed, and who had found the one avenue available to her to demand it: the curse tablets, the mystery initiations, the Bonadea ceremony, the birthday invitation from Vindolanda. The prayer scratched onto a small piece of lead and thrown into a sacred spring in the hope that something was listening. These are not the grand monuments of Roman civilization. They are not the Colosseum or the aqueducts or the legal codes that shaped centuries of Western law. They are something smaller and I think more important. They are the evidence that inside every woman navigating the official structures of Roman life, the legal limitations, the social expectations, the careful management of public behavior, there was an interior life, vast, complicated, fully felt, angry sometimes, grieving sometimes, devoted, hopeful, exhausted, persistent, the interior life of a person. Not a category, not a legal status, not a symbol of virtue or a cautionary tale. A person. We're almost at the end of our journey tonight. Just one chapter remains, and it is in many ways the one I have been building toward all along, because we have spent this entire evening talking about women who were in the official record barely visible, but they left traces, in stone, in lead, in the fragile survival of papyrus in a dry Egyptian desert, in the preserved ash of a city that had no idea the mountain above it was about to end its world. They left traces, and those traces, when you know how to look at them, when you slow down enough to listen to what they are saying, are some of the most moving documents in all of human history. The final chapter of tonight's story is about those traces, about the women Rome tried to silence, about the words that survived anyway, and about what it feels like, what it genuinely unexpectedly feels like to hear a voice speaking to you across 2,000 years of silence. Stay with me. We are almost there. There is a road outside Rome called the Via Appia, the Appian Way, built in 312. Before the Common Era, one of the oldest and most important roads in the entire Roman world, stretching from the city gates of Rome all the way south to the port of Brindisi on the Adriatic coast. For centuries it was the main artery of Roman military and commercial life. Armies marched on it, merchants travelled it, emperors rode along it in procession, and lining both sides of it for miles outside the city walls, because Roman law forbade burial within the city itself, were tombs, thousands of them. From the grandest mausoleums of the wealthiest families with carved reliefs and inscribed poetry, and life-sized portrait statues to the simplest markers, a name, a date, a line or two. I have walked parts of the Appian Way, and what strikes you if you slow down enough to actually read the stones is not the grandeur. It is the ordinary, the names you have never heard, the ages that stop you cold, the small, careful phrases that someone, a husband, a father, a child, a friend, chose to put into stone because they could not bear the idea of this person being forgotten. Tonight, that is where we end. Not with emperors, not with empresses, not with the famous and the powerful. We end at the stones. The Romans had a phrase they carved at the beginning of many funerary inscriptions, dismanibus, to the divine shades, to the spirits of the dead. It was an acknowledgement that the person being commemorated had passed into a different realm, the realm of the manes, the ancestral spirits that Roman religion believed continued to exist after death, and needed to be remembered, honoured and fed with offerings on certain days of the year. Dismanibus, you see it on thousands of Roman gravestones, abbreviated sometimes to just the letters D and M, 2 letters that meant this person existed and we are telling the gods, and what followed those 2 letters, the words that someone chose to put after them, is what I want to spend this final chapter with. Because those words taken together form something that no Roman historian intended to create, an accidental portrait of what Roman women actually were, in the language of the people who loved them, at the moment when honesty was all that was left. The most common funerary formula for Roman women, repeated so often across so many centuries and so many provinces that scholars call it the standard epitaph, praised a wife for being lanifica, a wool worker, pia, devoted to her family, her gods, her duties, pudica. Modest, that word again, the shadow of Pudicitia falling even onto the grave, frugi, frugal, careful with resources, domicida, one who stays home, and univira, a woman of one man, married once, faithful always, a woman whose entire identity in the official commemorative language of Rome was defined by her relationship to a single husband and a single household. This formula was so standard that it appeared with minor variations on the gravestones of women from Rome to Roman Britain, from Spain to Syria, across 4 centuries of imperial history. It was the official script, the approved version, the story Rome told about its women when it wanted to feel good about itself. And then there are the stones that went off script, the ones where grief or pride or love or all 3 together pushed through the formula and left something real. These are the ones I've been collecting in my mind for a long time, the ones that I keep coming back to. There is the inscription for a woman named Alia Potestas, found in Rome, written by a man who identified himself as her companion. The relationship is slightly unclear, which is itself interesting, and who composed for her one of the longest and most remarkable epitaphs in the entire Roman corpus. He described her as beautiful. He described her as hard-working up before anyone else last to bed. He described her as the kind of person who kept the peace in a household, who smoothed over conflicts, who made the people around her feel settled and cared for. And then, and this is the line that always gets me, He wrote that when he reached for her in the night and found her gone, he wept. He could not sleep without her. This man, whoever he was, whoever Alia Potestas was, sat down to write what amounted to a love poem in stone for a woman who had died, because he could not figure out any other way to hold on to the fact that she had existed. He was trying to keep her, and the best tool he had was a chisel and a piece of marble and whatever words he could find. There is another inscription found not in Rome but in the city of Lugdunum, which is the city we now call Lyon, in what was then the province of Gallia Lugdunensis. It commemorates a woman named Veturia. She was, the inscription tells us, 30 years old when she died. She'd been married twice, which means by the strict standard of the Univira ideal, she would not have qualified for that particular praise. But the person who wrote her epitaph did not seem to care about that. What they wrote was this: she had been a good wife. She had raised her children, and she had worked the inscription list her occupation, though the exact word has been partially damaged, and scholars debate the precise reading in a trade that required skill and consistency. She was 30 years old. She'd been married twice. She had children. She had a job. She had a name. And someone loved her enough to put all of that on a stone so that people walking past in Lyon 2,000 years later would know that Veturia had been here, that she had mattered. But my favourite, the one I keep returning to, the one that I think captures something essential about everything we have been talking about tonight, is not a long inscription. It is not a love poem in stone. It is 9 words, found in Rome, dating to approximately the 1st century of the Common Era. Placed on the grave of a woman named Amimone, her husband wrote it. 9 words in Latin, which translated as closely as possible into English read: "Here lies Amimone, wife of Marcus. She was the best and also a wool worker." That is it. The best and also a wool worker. I have thought about those 9 words more than I have thought about many much longer things, because there is something in the rhythm of that sentence, the grand claim followed immediately by the practical detail that feels so deeply, specifically human. He wanted to say she was the best, the absolute best, the best thing in his life, the best person he had known, the best full stop. And then some part of him felt that this needed to be grounded, anchored, made real in the language of Roman virtue and Roman daily life. So he added, and also a wool worker, as if to say, and I can prove it. I can prove she was the best because I watched her work. Every day, I watched her hands and her patience and her consistency and her care. And that is how I know. He buried his wife and he put 9 words on her stone, and somehow in those 9 words you can feel an entire marriage. Now, something I want to share with you because I think it earns its place in this story. Among all the inscriptions, all the tablets, all the papyri and the graffiti and the letters and the curse tablets and the wax tablets recording loans and transactions, there is one document that I think is, in some ways, the most remarkable of all. It is called the Laudatio Turiae, the Eulogy of Turia, discovered in Rome in the 16th century, inscribed on 2 large marble slabs that were originally displayed publicly, possibly on a mausoleum. It is the longest surviving funerary inscription from the ancient Roman world. We do not know for certain that the woman's name was Turia. Scholars have called her that based on some contextual evidence, but it remains a scholarly convention rather than a proven fact. What we know is that her husband wrote this inscription for her, and that he clearly felt as he was writing it that there were not enough words in Latin for what he wanted to say. He describes what she did for him during the civil wars, the political catastrophes of the late Republic that destroyed so many families. She hid him when his enemies were looking for him. She sold her own jewellery to fund his survival. She argued his case before Mark Antony himself stood in front of one of the most powerful and volatile men in the Roman world, and made the argument for her husband's life. Mark Antony's soldiers, apparently unhappy with this persistent woman who would not stop making her case, pushed her to the ground. She got back up and kept talking. Her husband was eventually pardoned. He came home. They were married according to his account for 41 years, and then she died. And he sat down to write the longest funerary inscription in Roman history, beginning with words that translate roughly as, "You deserve praise, you deserve lasting fame, but a day will not be enough to say all that should be said about you." He was right. A stone was not enough. A marble slab was not enough. An inscription read by scholars 2,000 years later, in a language that almost no one speaks anymore, it is not enough. But it is what survives. And it is in its own way extraordinary. So what do we take from all of this? We've spent this evening together walking through 2,500 years of distance through marble and ash and desert sand and the cold soil of Roman Britain, trying to find these women. And we found them. Not all of them. We will never find all of them. The loss of the unrecorded majority of Roman women's lives is real and permanent and worth grieving, but we found enough. Enough to know that they were not the passive background figures that a quick reading of Roman law would suggest. Enough to know that they ran businesses and managed estates and practiced medicine and built public buildings and wrote their names in graffiti and dropped their anger into sacred springs and invited their friends to birthday parties at the edge of the empire. Enough to know that they were brilliant and frustrated and funny and afraid and capable of extraordinary love and perfectly capable of extraordinary anger and every human thing in between. Enough to know that the civilization Rome built was not built by the men whose names fill the history books. It was built by everyone, including the women who were told again and again and in 100 different ways that their contribution did not count. Here is what I think about when I think about all of them. I think about the distance between the official story and the true story. The official story of Rome was marble and speeches and military triumph, and the names of emperors carved into monuments meant to last forever. The true story of Rome was a woman bent over a wax tablet in a lamplit room recording a financial transaction. A girl dedicating her toys to the household gods the night before her wedding. A midwife arriving in the dark hours of morning with her bag of instruments and her hard-won knowledge and her quiet determination to bring someone safely through. A freed enslaved woman running through a city in chaos clutching a wooden box of coins. A wife in Lyon who was 30 years old and married twice and had children and a profession and a name. A woman at Bath who was angry about something and trusted a goddess to hear her. That is the true story, and I think it matters that we tell it. Not because the marble was wrong, but because the marble was never the whole picture. The whole picture is always more complicated, and more human, and more worth knowing. We are at the end of our time together tonight, and I want to close with something that I find genuinely moving every time I come back to it. The Romans believed that the dead needed to be remembered to rest, that the spirits of the forgotten wandered restless, unable to find peace because no one was holding them in mind. Memory in the Roman understanding was not just sentiment, it was sustenance. The dead needed it the way the living needed food, and so the living created these inscriptions, these stones, these carefully preserved letters and tablets and papyri. Not knowing, of course, that 2,000 years later someone would be reading them. Not knowing that their words would cross all that time and reach people they could not have imagined in a world that would have been incomprehensible to them. They just wrote, because someone they loved had been here, and they wanted the world to know. Well, tonight we know. We have carried these women with us for the last couple of hours. We have said their names: Amymone, Veturia, Alia, Potesta, Scribonia, Claudia, Severa, Faustilla, Eumachia, Pallas, Ursa, Dociliana. We have said their names. And by the Roman understanding of what that means, they have rested a little easier tonight. And so I think have we. There is something that happens when you spend time with history like this, when you allow it to get close enough to feel real, when you let the distance collapse and the people step forward out of the marble and become for a moment just people. You remember something that it is very easy to forget in the noise of daily life, that every person who has ever lived has had an inner world as vast and complicated and real as yours. Every person who walked these streets in any era, in any city, under any empire, they were afraid of something. They loved someone. They wanted things they could not quite reach. They had a life that felt to them like the only life, the real one, the one that mattered. Roman women understood this. They felt it completely. And the traces they left in stone and lead and ink and the borrowed walls of a city that would one day be ash are their way of reaching across everything that separates us and saying we were here, we felt it too, and we did not stop. Thank you. Genuinely, from wherever I'm sitting and wherever you're lying or resting right now, thank you for spending this time with these women, for listening to their stories, for letting their lives matter even briefly, even here in the quiet before sleep. If something in tonight's journey stayed with you, a name, a detail, a moment that felt unexpectedly close, I would love it if you told me in the comments. Tell me which part surprised you most. Tell me which woman you found yourself thinking about. Tell me if you have ever read about Roman history before and found it felt different tonight. And if you are watching this for the first time and you have somehow stayed with me for this entire journey, first of all, thank you. Second of all, you might want to check if it is 3 a.m. Just a thought. If tonight's story moved you in any way, please share it with someone who loves history, or someone who thinks they do not love history but might change their mind. And if you want more nights like this, 1 more stories from the parts of history that usually stay in the footnotes, subscribe. Stay close. Because the next story we're going to tell is one that most people think they know. They do not. Not the way we're going to tell it. Rest well tonight, and remember, somewhere under the stone and the ash and 2,000 years of silence they are resting too.